The paper in the Lori Ruff case feels thin under your fingers tonight, almost too ordinary for the strange evidence it carried for so many years. Settle in slowly, because there's no hurry in this room, and the file will wait while your breathing finds its quieter pace. You begin with a lockbox, a marriage certificate, a few worn identity papers, and the soft scrape of old folders sliding across a desk in Texas. The Lori Ruff case did not open like a chase. It opened like a drawer that had been shut for too long, with dust along the metal lip and questions folded inside. You can picture the box on the table, small enough to carry, heavy enough to matter. After Lori Ruff died in late December of 2010, her husband's family found papers that did not make a simple life any simpler. There were documents under names that seemed to belong to other people, and one name, Becky Sue Turner, led backward instead of forward. At first we sit with that name gently, was a little girl who had died many years earlier in Washington state, and yet her birth certificate had been used by a young woman who later became Lori Erica Kennedy, and then Lori Erica Ruff. The paper trail was not loud, it was quiet, typed, stamped, filed, and carried from one office to another. You turn the first page, and the sound is small in the room. This is how patient investigation often begins, not with a dramatic moment, but with a clerk's stamp, a date, a courthouse record, and someone noticing that the edges do not quite meet. The evidence was weird because it was so plain, just papers doing what papers do, while hiding a life behind them. Lori's life in Texas had seemed, from the outside, difficult but recognizable. She married Blake Ruff, joined a family, had a daughter, and lived among people who later remembered how guarded she could be. You can sit with that, without judging her. Some people keep their past in a box because it hurts, and some keep it there because it cannot be explained. The first investigators had to work with what they could hold. They had no full confession waiting in an envelope, no tidy note that named a birthplace, no easy list of parents and schools and childhood streets. They had the faint smell of paper, the dull shine of official seals, and a trail that appeared to begin in the late 1980s. So we begin there, where the strange evidence began to point. A young woman using the name Becky Sue Turner obtained identification and then changed her name in court. The new name was Lori Erica Kennedy. Later, after marriage, she became Lori Erica Ruff, and that is the name most people came to know after the mystery opened. The courthouse detail matters because it gives you a rhythm. First a birth certificate, then an identification card, then a legal name change, then a life built under that name. You can almost hear the typewriter in a county office, or the rubber stamp pressing down, while nobody at the counter realizes the person in front of them is becoming harder to find. But there was one more detail in the papers, and it made the file feel colder beneath the lamp. The name Becky Sue Turner did not belong to an adult woman starting over. It belonged to a child who had died before she could grow into the documents being used. When investigators traced that name back, they found a death record, and the neat line of identity suddenly bent in a way no ordinary paperwork should bend. You can pause there, because this is the kind of discovery that does not need forceful language. A dead child's birth certificate had become the beginning of someone else's adult life. The evidence was not violent on the page. It was administrative, nearly silent, and maybe that is why it lingered so deeply with the people who studied it. In those years, using a birth certificate to obtain new documents could still happen. Offices were busy, records were not always linked, and a person with patience could sometimes move through a system before computers learned to speak to one another. We should remember the time period, because the file belongs to paper systems, waiting rooms, ink pads, and clerks behind glass. You hold that context softly. The late 1980s were not the same as the world you know now, where a search can cross a country in a few seconds. Back then, a record in Washington, a name change in Texas, and an identification card in Idaho might sit apart like little islands, each one correct in its own drawer. That separation helped Lori Ruff remain unknown. It did not solve anything quickly, but it explained how the strange evidence could exist at all. When you read cold cases long enough, you begin to notice that mystery often lives in the space between systems, where one office closes at 5 and another never receives the question. For Lori Ruff, the question stayed inside the family after her death. Who had she been before the name change? Why had she hidden it? What had made her sever the old story so completely? The family searched the lockbox, and the papers answered only by becoming more complicated. Years later, another kind of patience entered the room, quieter than the first and just as important. You can imagine a genealogist's desk now, with a monitor glowing in the dark and coffee gone cool beside a stack of notes. The Lori Ruff case moved from courthouses and vital records into databases, family trees, and genetic clues. The tools changed, but the posture stayed the same. Someone had to sit still long enough to compare. The Social Security investigator who worked the case, along with others who cared about the mystery, followed the paper as far as paper could go. They looked at the stolen identity, the name changes, the age, the locations, and the fragments Lori had left behind. Each fact was small, but the shape of them began to matter. There were handwritten notes among Lori's possessions, and they had their own quiet strangeness. Some contained words and names that seemed important, though not always understandable. You can see them as a person might see them at midnight, tilted under a lamp, wondering whether a scribble is a clue, a memory, or only a private shorthand, now cut loose from its owner. That is one of the tender difficulties in this case. Not every odd thing is a key. Some things are only human, and if we're patient, we allow that possibility to remain. A note can be evidence, but it can also be loneliness, anxiety, planning, confusion, or a thought that made sense only to the person who wrote it. Still, the note stayed in the file. They had to. In patient detective work, you do not throw away a small thing because it refuses to explain itself on the first night. You label it, preserve it, return to it later, and let time decide whether it belongs near the center or near the edge. The investigation also held photographs, dates, addresses, and memories from people who had known Lori as an adult. You move through them slowly, because they do not form a straight road. They form a neighborhood of impressions. She was private. She was careful. She resisted questions. She seemed to have built a wall around anything that came before. We can sit with the wall without trying to break it. The people around Lori wanted answers. But answers in a case like this arrive with their own weight. Behind the false documents, there was a real person. And behind that real person, there were other real people, perhaps waiting without knowing they were waiting. But the paper trail had reached its dimmest corner, and another box had to come down from the shelf. When genetic genealogy entered the Lori Ruff case, the evidence became smaller than paper and much older than any name. DNA does not tell a bedtime story by itself. It offers relationships, hints, distances, and probabilities, like faint lights across a dark field. Someone still has to walk between them carefully. The eventual identification came through patient comparison with relatives and family lines. Lori Ruff, the woman known under that name in Texas, was identified as Kimberly McLean, a young woman from the Philadelphia area who had left home in the 1980s. The name did not arrive with thunder. It arrived because people compared records until the quiet pattern held. You can imagine that moment in a very plain way. A researcher leans closer to the screen. A family tree begins to narrow. A birth date, a missing daughter, a vanished young woman, and an adult life under another name begin to settle into one outline. The room might still smell of paper, even with the computer humming. Kimberly McLean had grown up far from the Texas life that later bore the name Lori Ruff. She had family, a childhood, and a history that had not been erased, only separated from the name everyone was using. When she left, she was still young, and whatever reasons she carried with her went mostly unspoken into the years that followed. This is where we go gently. The identification solved the question of who Lori had been, but it did not solve every question of who Lori had been. But it did not solve every question of who Lori had been. But it did not solve every question of who Lori had been. But it did not solve every question of who Lori had been. But it did not solve every question of who Lori had been. You can know the root of the papers and still not know the weather inside a person. That distinction matters for sleep and for compassion. We are not here to force meaning onto silence. We are here to sit beside the file and notice how much patient work it took to restore one true name. The strange evidence solved a central mystery, but it did not turn a human life into something simple. Across the years, the lockbox became less like a puzzle box and more like a small archive of survival. Inside it, the documents had carried several lives at once. Becky Sue Turner's name was there, borrowed from a record that never should have become a shield. Lori Erica Kennedy was there, created through a legal process. Lori Erica Ruff was there, tied to marriage, motherhood, conflict, and the last years in Texas. And beneath those names, Kimberly McLean was waiting. You can feel how heavy one small box becomes when it carries that much. The hinge may creak, the papers may shift, and a photograph may catch the light at one corner. Nothing in the object itself announces its importance. It is only after someone starts reading that the room changes. The weird evidence in the Lori Ruff case was not weird because it was colorful or theatrical. It was weird because it was bureaucratic and intimate at the same time. A birth certificate, a court order, an identification document, and a note can look harmless apart, then become deeply strange when laid together in the right order. That order took time to see. Family members had to keep asking. Investigators had to preserve what seemed useful. Genealogists had to follow lines through cousins, records, and old family branches. The case asked for no single brilliant leap, only a long obedience to small facts. You can let that idea rest for a moment. Many cold cases are solved by patients disguised as routine. Someone opens the file again. Someone checks a record again. Someone notices that a date fits better than it did last year, because a database has grown, or because a cousin has uploaded DNA, or because an old assumption has finally loosened. In Lori's case, the answer came after years of that slow returning. The name Kimberly McLean did not erase Lori Ruff, and Lori Ruff did not erase Kimberly. Both names belong to the same life, seen from different ends of the hallway. We can stand there quietly and understand that identity, once broken into documents, takes care to gather again. But even after the name returned, the file still held questions that did not soften into answers. You turn another page, and the paper sound is almost the only sound in the room. The solved part of the Lori Ruff case is clear enough now. The woman known as Lori Ruff was born Kimberly McLean. The documents in the lockbox, especially the borrowed birth certificate and name change records, helped lead investigators toward that truth. Yet, the deeper reasons remain more private. Why did Kimberly leave? Why choose such a complete break? Why maintain the secrecy through marriage, family life, and motherhood? Those questions are not solved by a certificate. They live in the space where official evidence meets human pain. People who study cold cases learn to respect that space. You can gather the records and still leave room around the person. You can say what is known without pretending to know what cannot be known. That restraint is part of the work, especially in a case where the central figure is no longer here to speak for herself. The family Lori married into had lived with uncertainty and concern. Her birth family had lived with absence. Both sides were left holding different halves of the same silence, and the identification joined those halves without making them easy. We can imagine the mixed feeling of that news, the relief of a name, and the ache of all the years between. The room around the file feels still now. There might be rain against a window, or the faint dry scent of cardboard, or the soft pressure of your hands resting beside the pages. These details matter because they keep the case human. They remind us that investigation is not only information, it is also endurance. When the name Kimberly McLean returned, it did not arrive alone. It brought family history back into view, and it placed Lori Ruff's life inside a longer story. The strange evidence had done what evidence is meant to do. It had pointed past itself, towards someone real. And when evidence points past itself, you learn to follow without pressing too hard. In the Lori Ruff case, each document was a doorway, but every doorway opened into another quiet room. You could step through one and find a courthouse counter, step through another and find a childhood home, and step through another to find a family waiting decades for a shape to return. None of it moved quickly. The truth had to come forward in layers, like old ink warming under a desk lamp. You might begin again with the birth certificate, because that small sheet of paper carried so much of the strange weight. Becky Sue Turner's name had been taken from a record of a child who could not use it anymore, and that fact gave investigators a starting point that felt both precise and deeply uneasy. The evidence did not tell them who Lori was, but it told them who she was not. Sometimes that is the first honest gift a file gives you. In a patient investigation, knowing what is false can matter almost as much as knowing what is true. You clear away one name, then another, and the desk becomes less cluttered by small degrees. The Lori Ruff case was built from that clearing. Becky Sue Turner was not Lori. Lori Erica Kennedy had been created later. Lori Erica Ruff came after marriage. Somewhere before all of those names, a young woman had existed without needing borrowed paper. You can feel the investigators moving backward from the cleanest documents to the oldest shadows. A name change order can seem straightforward, with its formal language and court seal, yet it raises a question no clerk is asked to answer. Why would someone arrive with one identity, request another, and then carry the new one so completely that even close family could not see behind it? The court made the change official. It did not make it understandable. The office where that paper was filed might have smelled of toner, dust, and winter coats drying after rain. You can imagine fluorescent light on the counter, the scrape of a pen, and the faint pressure of someone waiting her turn. If you were the clerk, you would see a person completing a routine legal request. You would not see the decades of mystery that would later gather around the stamp. That is one of the strange comforts and strange limits of records. They hold what they were designed to hold, and nothing more. The name, the date, the signature, the legal outcome. They do not record whether someone's hand trembled, whether she felt relief as she left the building, or whether she looked back once before stepping into the ordinary air. In the Lori Ruff case, we keep returning to ordinary air. That is where most of the mystery lives. It lives in offices, rented rooms, family dinners, school forms, and the envelopes people save because they might be needed later. You sit with the file, and the more you read, the more you understand that the weird evidence was not hidden in a secret place. It was hidden in plain administration. The investigators who studied the documents had to accept that the official trail began too late. Before the name Becky Sue Turner was used, before Lori Erica Kennedy appeared on paper, there was very little to follow. You can almost see the blank space on the page. It is not empty because nothing happened. It is empty because the records had not yet been connected to the right name. That blankness must have been difficult for the family. A mystery can become heavier when it has dates and addresses, but no beginning. People want to know where a loved one came from, not as a matter of curiosity alone, but because origin shapes ordinary care. A childhood illness, a family pattern, an old story from a parent, all of it becomes part of knowing someone beside you at the table. Lori guarded that earlier part fiercely. By many accounts, she did not welcome questions about her past, and those around her learned that the subject led nowhere soft. You can hold that fact gently. Privacy can be a wall, but sometimes a wall was first built as shelter. We do not know what she thought she was protecting, only that she protected it for a very long time. As you read deeper, the lockbox begins to feel less like a clue container and more like a portrait drawn in paperwork. It held the evidence of reinvention, but also the tension of someone unable to let the old papers disappear entirely. If Lori had wanted no trace at all, she might have destroyed more. Instead, the documents stayed close, preserved, hidden, and waiting without any promise that anyone would understand them. That waiting is part of the Lori Ruff case. The documents waited through marriage. They waited through moves and hard conversations. They waited through the birth of a child and the strain that followed. They waited until after Lori's death, when other hands opened the box and found that grief had been joined by a question no one in the family could easily set down. The first shock of the discovery must have faded into a duller, steadier work. You can imagine the family making phone calls, unfolding records, asking agencies what a name meant and whether a birth certificate could be traced. There is a particular sound to that kind of work, the hold music, the shuffled notes, the sigh before repeating a date to another office. It is not dramatic, it is tiring. Yet tired work can become important work. The family's persistence kept the question alive long enough for people with the right tools to enter the case. In cold investigations, that is often how progress happens. Someone refuses to let the file sink entirely. Someone keeps one folder on a shelf within reach. Someone says, not today perhaps, but someday this may make sense. The Social Security Administration had reason to care because an identity had been built through official systems. That part of the Lori Ruff case shows how a personal mystery can cross into public records, where one false beginning can move through tax forms, licenses, benefits, and legal documents. You can sit with that quietly because it is not only a puzzle about one woman, it is also a lesson about how records trust one another. A birth certificate says a person was born. An identification card says the person presenting it belongs to that name. A court order says a name has changed. Each paper leans on the one before it, like books resting against each other on a shelf. When the first book is not truly connected to the person holding it, the whole row can still stand for years. That is why the Becky Sue Turner document mattered so much. It was not merely odd, it was structural. It showed investigators where the constructed identity had been anchored, and once they understood the anchor was borrowed, they could stop treating Lori's official history as a natural record of her life. You can feel the shift there, quiet but important. The file stopped being biography and became reconstruction. Reconstruction is slow work. You start with what is known and build careful scaffolding around what is missing. Lori Ruff lived in Texas. Before that, she had changed her name. Before that, she used Becky Sue Turner's birth record. Before that, there was a young woman whose true name had not yet returned. You look at the chain, and the missing first link becomes the shape your eyes keep finding. Investigators also examined the locations tied to the papers. The Pacific Northwest entered the story through Becky Sue Turner. Idaho entered through identification. Texas entered through name change, marriage, and death. Pennsylvania would only become clear later, when Kimberly McLean's name came home to the case. Until then, the map was misleading because a person can pass through a place without belonging to it. You can trace the imagined route with one finger on an old map. The paper feels slightly raised at the fold, and the state borders seem too clean for a life that was anything but cleanly divided. Washington, Idaho, Texas, Pennsylvania. Each place gave the investigators something, but none gave everything. The Lori Ruff case had to be read as movement, not as a single address. Movement can hide a person. It can also reveal what they needed from the world. Lori, under her chosen name, seemed to want distance from what came before, and distance can be built physically as well as legally. A new state gives you new clerks, new neighbors, new routines, and fewer people who remember your face from childhood. You can understand the practical logic, even while the emotional reason remains beyond reach. The odd notes found among Lori's belongings made that emotional distance harder to interpret. Some were said to include scattered names or words, fragments that invited speculation. You might hold one under the light and wonder whether it was a memory aid, a plan, a fear, or a private list with no wider meaning. In cold cases, fragments are tempting. They ask to be made into sentences. But we should be careful with fragments. A person's private papers can contain unfinished thoughts that were never meant to guide anyone else. The Lori Ruff case already had enough mystery without forcing every scrap into a firm answer. You can set the notes beside the certificates and let them breathe. They may show state of mind. They may show nothing more than a person trying to manage what she could not say aloud. That restraint does not weaken the investigation. It makes it kinder and more accurate. Detectives, genealogists, and families all have to live with uncertainty while still doing useful work. You can mark a document as important and still admit you do not know what it means. The file does not punish patience. It often rewards it, though usually later than anyone would like. The physical feel of the records matters here because it slows us down. A photocopy is not a revelation by itself. It has a faint chemical smell, a grayness around the edges, and a texture that catches slightly when you slide it over another page. You read it once, then again, and the meaning does not rise all at once. It gathers. In the Lori Ruff case, meaning gathered around the act of naming. Names are supposed to hold a person gently in the world, tying them to family, school records, photographs, and the stories other people tell when they remember. Lori had taken a name from a child who had died, created another, and married into a third. You can feel how each name covered and preserved at the same time. Kimberly McLean's name, when it finally emerged, did something different. It did not cover. It connected. It connected Lori to a birth family, to a childhood, to a young departure, and to the long absence that had remained unresolved. For those who had wondered about Kimberly, the answer must have brought both clarity and sorrow. The person was found, but not in time for reunion. You and I can sit with that mixed truth without trying to smooth it over. Cold cases often give answers too late. A name returns after the voice is gone. A file is solved after the people who needed it have spent years making peace with uncertainty. The work still matters. It matters because truth matters, even when it arrives with quiet grief attached. The genetic work that helped identify Lori as Kimberly depended on relatives who may never have imagined they were part of the case. A family tree can look peaceful on a screen, with lines running from one name to another, but each line represents living connections, old marriages, migrations, memories, and ordinary people making their own choices. You can see how delicate the work must be. It is science, but it is also family. Genetic genealogy asks investigators to compare shared ancestry, not to pull a name from the air. It works through degrees of relationship, through cousin matches, through public records, obituaries, marriage notices, census records, and the patient building of branches. In the Lori Ruff case, the method helped bridge the gap left by the false documents. It found biological belonging where paperwork had been intentionally rerouted. You can imagine the researcher building a tree late at night. One ancestor leads to several children. Those children lead to grandchildren, and the names begin spreading like fine roots across the page. Some branches can be trimmed away. Others need more checking. A date of birth matters. A missing woman matters. A family story suddenly matters more than it did an hour before. There is a quiet humility in that kind of investigation. The researcher does not command the answer to appear. She or he asks the same patient questions many times. Does this age fit? Does this location fit? Does this disappearance fit the approximate time when Lori's created identity began? You keep returning to the same facts, and each return makes the outline a little less faint. The strange evidence, then, was not only the lockbox, it was the contrast between paper identity and biological relationship. One set of records said one thing, the hidden trail of ancestry said another. When those two systems finally met, the long confusion began to settle. You can feel that settlement as a soft lowering, like pages lying flat after being held open too long. Still, settlement is not the same as simplicity. Once Kimberly McLean was identified, people could ask more precise questions, but they could not ask Kimberly herself. That absence remains central to the Lori Ruff case. It is why the story continues to feel unresolved in a human sense, even though the main identity question was answered. The name returned, but the reasons stayed mostly in the dark. The difference between solved and understood can be wide. You might solve a record question and still not understand a life. You might know where someone was born, what name she took, where she lived, and when she died, yet still be unable to hear the inner sentence that explains why she left. The file can hold facts. It cannot always hold motive. That is not failure. It is the boundary of evidence. A patient detective learns to respect boundaries, especially around people who suffered privately. We can say Lori concealed her past. We can say she used Becky Sue Turner's birth certificate. We can say she was Kimberly McLean. Beyond that, the wording must soften, because speculation can become a kind of noise. The family photographs, if you imagine them, have that particular stillness older pictures carry. Faces caught in light, hair shaped by the fashion of the time, shoulders turned slightly towards someone just outside the frame. You might look at a young Kimberly and wonder what she expected life to become. Then you remind yourself that wondering is not knowing. The photograph gives presence, not explanation. The adult photographs of Lori would offer another kind of presence. A woman with a life in Texas, a married name, neighbors' documents and responsibilities. People may search the face for hints, but faces are not files. They do not owe us answers. You can let both images exist without forcing them together too quickly, because one person can carry many versions of herself across time. The more you sit with the Lori Ruff case, the more the phrase weird evidence begins to feel almost too small. The evidence was strange, yes, but it was also ordinary evidence, placed under extraordinary pressure. A birth certificate becomes strange only because of how it was used. A name change becomes strange only because of what came before. A lockbox becomes strange only because of what it preserved. The box itself would not have known its contents were important. It may have sat in a closet, under other objects, near the smell of stored fabric and household dust. It may have been moved without being opened. It may have been passed over during ordinary cleaning. You can picture it waiting through the unremarkable hours of a house, holding papers that would later redraw a life. This is why cold cases often feel like conversations with objects. The object has no voice, but it has endured. It has been present when people forgot it, and it can suddenly become central when someone finally asks the right question. In Lori's case, the lockbox kept the constructed identity from vanishing completely. It held enough truth and untruth together that investigators could begin. There is tenderness in that, though it may not appear so at first. Lori had hidden her past, but the hidden papers made it possible for her true name to be found. The evidence she kept close became the evidence that connected her back to Kimberly McLean. You can sit with that paradox for a while. A shield became a bridge. The investigators did not have to know what Lori intended when she preserved those documents. Intention is often harder to prove than sequence. What mattered first was the sequence itself. Becky Sue Turner's certificate. A new identification. A legal name change to Lori Erica Kennedy. Marriage into the Ruff family. The discovery after death. The later genetic identification. Step by step, the file learned how to speak. You can almost hear that speaking in the softest possible way. Not a shout, not an accusation, just the rustle of pages being placed in order. This came before that. This name belonged there. This woman was not who the first record said she was. This family had been missing someone. This life had crossed the country under a name made from paperwork. When we follow the Lori Ruff case through those steps, we also follow the history of investigative tools. The early part belongs to clerks and paper archives. The middle belongs to persistent agency work, public attention, and the careful sharing of details. The later part belongs to genetic genealogy and database comparison. Each era did what it could with what it had. That matters because it keeps us from asking why no one solved it instantly. Cases are not solved by future tools in the past. People work inside their own time, with their own limits, and the Lori Ruff case had to wait for methods that could reach beyond a stolen certificate. You can feel the years in that waiting, stacked softly like folders in a storage room. Waiting rooms have their own atmosphere, plastic chairs, low voices, a clock that seems louder than it should be. Families waiting for answers occupy a different kind of room, even when they are at home. They wait beside phones, mailboxes, birthdays, holidays, and private anniversaries that do not appear in official records. The waiting becomes part of the family weather. For Kimberly McLean's birth family, the waiting must have taken a shape we can only approach carefully. A young person leaves, and years pass, and the mind makes room for many possibilities. You may hope, then protect yourself from hope, then find hope again in some smaller form. The eventual answer did not return Kimberly alive, but it did return her name to the people who had first known it. For the Ruff family, the waiting was different, but also real. They had known Lori in the final chapter of her life, and they had questions about the woman who had entered their family. Their uncertainty began after her death, when grief had already unsettled the house. You can imagine how disorienting it would be to mourn someone and discover, at the same time, that her earliest story had been concealed. Neither side owned the whole truth alone. One family had the beginning, one had the end. The evidence, strange and patient, eventually allowed those halves to recognize each other. That does not make the story easy. It only makes it more complete. In cold cases, completeness is sometimes the gentlest form of justice available. You can place yourself at the detective's desk again, because that is where the case feels most manageable tonight. There is a lamp with a warm shade, and beyond it, the room falls into calm shadow. The file is open to a timeline. You run your eye down the dates, not to rush them, but to let their order become familiar. Kimberly McLean is born in 1968. Becky Sue Turner dies as a child in 1971. In the 1980s, Kimberly leaves her family. A young woman later uses Becky's birth certificate. She becomes Lori Erica Kennedy through a legal name change in 1988. Years pass. Lori marries Blake Ruff. More years pass. After Lori's death in 2010, the lockbox is opened, and the question begins its long return. A timeline can look clean when spoken that way, but lived time is never clean. Between those dates were mornings, errands, rented rooms, bills, arguments, meals, and silence. You can respect the timeline while remembering all the unstated hours inside it. The Lori Ruff case is not only a line of events, it is a life lived under careful pressure. That pressure showed itself in the way Lori resisted questions, at least as others later remembered. If someone asked about her family, the answer might close quickly. If someone pushed, the subject might become difficult. You can imagine relatives learning to avoid certain conversational doors. Over time, avoidance itself becomes a kind of furniture in the room, something everyone walks around without naming. The patient investigator notices that furniture, not to shame anyone, but because patterns matter. A person who will not discuss the past may be protecting privacy, escaping pain, hiding wrongdoing, or simply unable to bear the question. The evidence can show the refusal. it cannot easily show which reason sat behind it. So you mark the pattern, and you keep reading. Lori's adult life also included motherhood, and that detail asks for special gentleness. A child was born into a family that later had to carry a story far too complicated for any child to deserve. We do not need to dwell on private pain to understand its weight. The case file has enough room for compassion toward everyone touched by Lori's secrecy, including those too young to choose any part of it. When a cold case moves through families, it does not move like an abstract puzzle. It moves through dinner tables, bedrooms, legal documents, and the stories people decide when a child is old enough to hear. You can feel how careful the grown-ups would need to be. Truth matters, but so does timing, and so does tenderness. The public became interested in the Lori Ruff case because the facts seemed almost fictional, though they were painfully real. A woman with a hidden identity, a dead child's birth certificate, a lockbox of documents, a true name recovered through genealogy. You can understand why people leaned closer, but the calmer reading asks us to lean closer without taking. Attention should be careful when the people are real. That is why we keep returning to the desk, the lamp, and the pages. The quiet setting helps the story remain human-sized. We are not chasing a thrill. We are examining how a life moved through systems, how those systems failed to ask certain questions, and how later systems finally answered one. The Lori Ruff case becomes a study in patience rather than spectacle. The weirdest evidence may be the most bureaucratic evidence, because bureaucracy is supposed to be dull. A form has boxes, a certificate has seals, a court order has formal phrases. These things are not designed for mystery, yet in Lori's case, the dullness itself helped the disguise hold. People trust dull documents precisely because they look too ordinary to doubt. You can see how that trust works. A clerk checks whether the paper has the required information. A judge sees a petition for a name change. A later institution accepts the changed name because the court has approved it. Each person performs a reasonable task within a narrow window. No one sees the whole corridor. The mystery grows in the spaces between their windows. Patient detective work widens the window. It asks, what did this document rely upon? Where did that earlier document come from? Does the person named here connect to the person standing there? In the Lori Ruff case, widening the window revealed the impossible fact that Becky Sue Turner could not be the adult woman using her record. From there, the investigation had to look elsewhere. Looking elsewhere took years. You can let the word years rest there without hurry. Years mean seasons changing over unsolved questions. Years mean files copied, stored, reopened and discussed again. Years mean people aging while an answer remains just beyond reach. They also mean technology changing quietly in the background until a method that once seemed unavailable becomes practical. Genetic genealogy did not simply appear as magic. It grew from databases, testing companies, public records, and researchers willing to spend long hours making careful comparisons. In Lori's case, that world of patient matching eventually did what the paperwork could not. It found kinship behind the mask. You can imagine the answer arriving not as a bang, but as a slow alignment. Alignment is a useful word here. The birth year aligned. The disappearance period aligned. The genetic relationships aligned. The absence of Kimberly McLean and the constructed presence of Lori Ruff began to occupy the same space. Investigators could test the fit, strengthen it, and finally say the name with confidence. The room, after so many years, had one less shadow. Still, after a shadow lifts, you often notice the ones behind it. Why Kimberly became Lori remains the question that cannot be answered with the same firmness. Some reports and family memories may suggest difficulty, independence, conflict, or distress, but suggestion is not certainty. You and I can keep the language modest. It is better to say the reason remains unclear than to decorate the silence. There is dignity in modest language. It lets the facts stand without forcing them to perform. The Lori Ruff case does not need embellishment. The actual evidence is strange enough. and the actual patience is moving enough. A true name was lost under layers of official paper, and people kept working until they could lift those layers one by one. You might notice, as you sit with the file, that the case has a repeating pattern of concealment and preservation. Lori concealed her origin, but preserved the documents. The paper trail concealed Kimberly, but preserved clues to the concealment. DNA had been silent for years, but preserved the biological connection until the right tools could read it. Hidden things were not destroyed. They were waiting. That kind of waiting feels almost geological. Not fast, not responsive, not concerned with our impatience. Evidence can wait in a drawer. A genetic relationship can wait in living descendants. A family story can wait in someone's memory. Then one year, one researcher asks a question in the right way, and the old waiting becomes useful. You can hear the quiet click of that usefulness in the Lori Ruff case. It is the click of a box opening, the click of a keyboard key, the click of a record match saved to a file. Small sounds, all of them. None belongs to a thriller. They belong to patient work, performed by people who know that truth often arrives in increments. The story also reminds us how identity is both personal and communal. Lori could choose a name legally, and that name became real in many everyday ways. It appeared on documents, mail, and family records. But birth identity also connected her to people beyond her choosing, to parents, siblings, relatives, and histories that continued whether or not she acknowledged them. The case sits between those realities. You can feel the human difficulty there. A person may need to leave, and a family may need to know. A person may reinvent herself, and others may still grieve the disappearance of the original name. The law can permit change, but it cannot erase relational consequence. The Lori Ruff case asks us to hold these truths together without making them fight. In the quieter hours, a detective might think less about the cleverness of the evidence and more about the loneliness inside it. To build a life that requires constant guarding must take energy. Every casual question can become a locked door. Every family gathering can hold the risk of someone asking too much. You can imagine the fatigue of that. Even if the reason for it remains unknown, that does not excuse harm caused by secrecy, but it helps us keep our humanity while reading. Lori's choices affected others, and those effects were real. At the same time, Lori herself was not merely a mystery mechanism. She was a person who carried something she did not share. The file gives us consequences more clearly than it gives us causes. The evidence after her death made those consequences visible. The family had to confront false identity, legal complications, and emotional confusion. Agencies had to determine whether records had been misused. Researchers had to separate rumor from documentation. You can see how a single hidden past can ripple outward, touching people who never knew they were standing near the edge of it. Yet the work stayed methodical. That steadiness is worth noticing. No one could solve the Lori Ruff case by insisting harder. They had to assemble. They had to compare. They had to ask agencies, examine records, and later use genetic tools. The case moved because people accepted its pace. Sometimes the only way through a mystery is to stop demanding speed from it. You can let that thought settle with the sound of rain, if you like. Rain on glass has the same patient quality, tapping without urgency, filling the room without asking for attention. The file remains open beneath the lamp. A corner of one page lifts slightly in the air from a vent. You smooth it down, and the timeline stays where it is. The legal name change to Lori Erica Kennedy deserves another quiet look because it marks the moment the created identity became more durable. A person can use a name informally, but a court order gives it structure. Once the court accepted the change, later records could grow from it naturally. The new name became a kind of trellis, and the rest of the life climbed it. In the Lori Ruff case, that trellis stood for years. It supported documents, employment, marriage, and parenthood. People who met Lori under that name had no reason to imagine it was rooted in something borrowed. Most of us accept names as given. We do not examine the soil beneath them unless something makes the plant lean at an impossible angle. The impossible angle appeared only after the lockbox. That is when Lori's name no longer seemed to reach naturally backward. Instead, it stopped at the name change, then pointed to Becky Sue Turner, then stopped again at the death record. You can feel the investigators reaching that second stop. It must have been like walking down a hallway and finding the floor end too soon. When a paper trail ends too soon, investigators look for side doors, photographs, handwriting, dental records, if available, school histories, missing person reports, family stories. In Lori's case, the side doors were difficult because the constructed identity had been so effective. Without a true original name, even searching missing persons databases could become uncertain. Age estimates and locations could be wrong. The map could mislead. That uncertainty made genetic genealogy especially valuable. It did not require Lori to have told the truth about where she came from. It did not require the stolen birth certificate to point in the right direction. Biological relationship bypassed the false route and began elsewhere. You can think of it as finding a river beneath a road that had been painted on the ground. Even then, the work needed human judgment. DNA matches can suggest families, but records must confirm the path. Researchers must rule out branches, check dates, and consider whether a person in the right family disappeared at the right time. In the Lori Ruff case, the identification as Kimberly McLean had to be built carefully enough to withstand scrutiny, not merely hoped into place. There is calm beauty in careful enough. It is not flashy. It does not make a dramatic entrance. It is the beauty of a clean table, a labeled folder, a note written clearly for the next person who will read it. Patient investigators leave trails for each other. They understand that the work may outlast their own shift, their own job, or even their own lifetime. Cold case units are built on that understanding. A detective may inherit a file from someone retired, then pass it to someone not yet assigned. The paper softens, the photographs fade, the questions remain. In the Lori Ruff case, the time span was shorter than some older mysteries, but the principle was the same. Evidence needed caretakers until the right method arrived. You can imagine an evidence room at night, though most of the work happened in ordinary daytime hours. Shelves stand in rows, boxes rest under labels, the air is dry and cool, and every container holds a little refusal to forget. Not every file will be solved, not every question will answer, but keeping the material safe preserves the possibility of future clarity. That possibility mattered here. If the lockbox contents had been discarded, if the name change papers had vanished, if the birth certificate trail had not been noticed, the identification might have been much harder. The Lori Ruff case teaches the quiet importance of preservation. A page kept for no clear reason can become the hinge of the whole story later. The same is true for memories. Someone remembers that Lori avoided her past. Someone remembers a conversation, a mood, a refusal, a pattern. Memories are less stable than paper, and we should treat them carefully, but they can still guide inquiry. You listen, you compare, you do not demand more certainty from memory than memory can give. That is another form of patience. In this case, memory and paperwork told similar broad stories. Lori had separated herself from a past she would not explain. The paperwork showed how she made that separation official. The memories showed how the separation felt to those around her. Together they did not reveal the reason, but they described the shape of the hidden place. You may notice how often the word place returns. A place on a map, a place in a family, a place in a file. Lori or Kimberly moved through all of these. She left one place and entered others, but the first place did not cease to exist. It waited in records, in relatives, and in the biological pattern that finally called her back by name. The name Kimberly McLean must have changed the sound of the case when it was first spoken by investigators. Lori Ruff had been the public mystery name, the name attached to articles, searches, and speculation. Kimberly McLean was the private origin, the recovered identity. You can feel how the mouth forms each differently. One belongs to the solved file. One belongs to a family. When the public hears a recovered name, it may feel like the end of a puzzle. For relatives, it may feel like the beginning of another morning. They have to join the person they remember with the person she became, and there is no easy instruction for that. You can sit beside that difficulty without intruding. The file gives the fact. The heart takes longer. The Lori Ruff case also asks what it means for evidence to solve only part of a case. The title says, "The weird evidence solved it," and in the central sense, it did. It solved the identity. It led from Lori Ruff back to Kimberly McLean. But a life is not a crossword. Filling one blank may reveal other blanks that are deeper and less suited to ink. Those deeper blanks are why the case remains contemplative. We are not waiting for a courtroom scene or a final confession. We are looking at the patient recovery of identity and the unanswered human reasons around it. The evidence did its work and then stopped where evidence often stops. It brought us to the door of motive, but not through it. You can rest there for a moment with your hand on the closed door. There is no need to force it open tonight. Sometimes the most honest way to tell an old mystery is to acknowledge the door, note its grain beneath your palm, and step back. We can know enough to honor the work without pretending to know what Kimberly never explained. The sound of pages continues softly. Another record, another date, another old address. The longer you sit, the less the case feels like a riddle, and the more it feels like a study of how people disappear without vanishing. Kimberly disappeared from her family's daily life. Lori appeared in another state. The same person lived through both facts. That duality can be difficult for systems, because systems prefer one name per person and one trail per life. Human beings are not always so cooperative. They leave, return, rename, conceal, and carry private histories into public forms. The Lori Ruff case became solvable only when investigators treated the paperwork as evidence of a path, not proof of a beginning. A path can be walked backward, but the footsteps may be faint. You look for places where the ground is pressed a little differently. The stolen birth certificate was one footprint. The court order was another. The lockbox was another. The genetic matches were not footprints exactly, but constellations overhead, showing direction when the road itself had thinned. There is a quiet wonder in that combination. Paper below, ancestry above, and patient people in between. The case needed all of them. Had investigators relied only on the birth certificate, they would have found Becky, whose life had ended long before. Had they relied only on Lori's adult records, they would have circled the constructed name. Had they relied only on curiosity, they might have drifted into speculation. Instead, the strongest work came from disciplined curiosity. That is the kind you and I keep beside us tonight. It asks questions, but it also checks the answers. It notices oddness, but it does not worship oddness. It lets a strange fact become useful only after it has been tested against other facts. The Lori Ruff case deserved that kind of care. You can imagine the first time someone realized the Becky Sue Turner record belonged to a deceased child. The room may not have changed, but the investigation did. A chair might have creaked. A pen might have stopped moving. Then the practical questions would begin. Who obtained the certificate? When was it used? What documents followed? Where did the woman go next? Practical questions can steady a disturbing discovery. They give the mind a path forward. In the Lori Ruff case, the borrowed identity could have invited wild theories, but the patient route was better. Trace the document, trace the name change, trace the adult life, preserve the unanswered questions for later. This is how a file becomes workable, instead of overwhelming. The adult life, meanwhile, was not only evidence. Lori had relationships, responsibilities, and ordinary days. She went places, spoke to people, filled forms, and made choices that others had to live beside. You can imagine her handwriting on household paperwork, perhaps firm, perhaps hurried. You can imagine keys on a counter, a phone ringing, a child's toy on the floor. Mystery does not cancel domestic life. That domestic life is part of why the case holds attention so quietly. The hidden identity was not found in some faraway archive alone. It was found after years of ordinary nearness. A husband did not know. In-laws did not know. Neighbors likely did not know. The distance between knowing someone daily and knowing their origin can be much wider than it appears. You might think of all the questions families ask without expecting them to matter. Where did you go to school? What was your mother like? Did you have siblings? What town were you from? These questions usually open small rooms of memory. For Lori, they seem to have approached locked rooms. The people around her noticed the locks, even if they could not see inside. In patient narration, we do not rattle those locks, we describe them. We let them explain the investigative problem without turning them into spectacle. The refusal to talk was meaningful because it fit the documents. The documents were meaningful because they explained why the refusal mattered. Each part made the other clearer, like two dim lamps brightening the same table. The identification as Kimberly McLean also altered the moral texture of the file. Before that, Lori was a woman with a hidden identity and a trail of borrowed documents. After that, she was also a missing daughter from a real family. The case widened. It did not become less strange, but it became more anchored in human loss. You can feel that anchoring in the simple act of saying Kimberly. It places the mystery in a home before the reinvention, before Texas, before the legal name change. It suggests school records, family photographs, neighbors who once knew her as young, and perhaps rooms where her absence was noticed. A name is never only a label. It is a place where memory gathers. For sleep, we let the gathering happen slowly. There is no need to hurry through the recovered identity. Kimberly McLean's name entered the case after years of uncertainty, and it deserves to be spoken with calm respect. Lori Ruff was the name she lived under for much of her adult life. Kimberly McLean was the name that restored the beginning. Both belong in the file. The investigators who helped make that restoration had to deal with public interest as well as private grief. Once a mystery circulates, people form theories, and theories can harden faster than evidence. You know this if you have spent time with old cases. The work is often not only finding truth, but gently moving aside all the things that looked like truth from a distance. In the Lori Ruff case, speculation had room to grow because the facts were unusual and incomplete. Some wondered whether she had been hiding from danger. Some wondered whether she had committed wrongdoing. Some wondered whether she had simply wanted to vanish from an unhappy past. The final identification narrowed the field, but it did not hand us a full explanation. So we leave room. Leaving room is not the same as losing interest. It is an active discipline. You keep the known facts close and let the unknown remain labeled as unknown. The paper has margins for a reason. You do not need to fill every inch. In a case like this, the blank space may be the most truthful part of the page. The strange evidence solved the name, and that is no small thing. A person without a true name in the public record is partly unmoored after death. Restoring the name restores connection, context, and a measure of dignity. You can feel why investigators and genealogists cared. They were not merely solving a curiosity. They were returning a life to its first chapter. That first chapter, however, was not available in full. We know Kimberly left her family as a young woman. We know she later created a new identity. We know she became Lori. Between those facts lies a private passage. You can imagine it as a road at dusk, visible at the beginning and end, with the middle hidden by trees. The temptation is to enter those trees with invented certainty. We won't do that. We can stand at the edge and listen to what the evidence allows. There may have been conflict, There may have been fear, there may have been pain, independence, or a need to sever ties completely. The file does not let us choose one answer with confidence. What it does allow is a careful appreciation of method. The Lori Ruff case demonstrates how identity mysteries are built and unbuilt. First, a vulnerable record is found. Then a new identity is layered over it. Then, legal documents reinforce the layer. Later, inconsistencies appear. Finally, modern genealogy reaches underneath the constructed surface and reconnects the person to kin. That sequence is almost gentle when written in plain language, though it must have been anything but gentle to live through. The paper did not feel pain. The people did. The investigators had to handle the paper, but their work affected families. That is why the tone matters. Calm is not distance. Calm is a way of staying respectful near difficult material. You can breathe with the file for a moment. The desk lamp hums faintly. Outside, the street is quiet. Somewhere in the imagined archive, a cartwheel squeaks, then stops. The Lori Ruff case remains open in front of you, not demanding alarm, only attention. Attention is enough tonight. The birth certificate, if placed beside the name change order, tells a story of transformation without permission from the past. Becky Sue Turner's record gave the appearance of origin. The court order gave the appearance of continuity. Together they created a public person who could function in the world. But the appearance was not the whole truth, and eventually the gap showed. Gaps can reveal more than solid lines. The gap between Becky's death and Lori's adult use of the name revealed impossibility. The gap between Lori's adult claims and her reluctance to discuss family revealed concealment. The gap between paperwork and DNA revealed the route back to Kimberly. You look at the gaps, and they become quiet windows. The investigators also had to consider age. Lori's apparent age, Kimberly's birth year, and the timeline of the new identity all had to fit. Age is an ordinary detail until it becomes a measurement tool. A year too early or late can break a theory. A matching range can keep it alive. In patient work, even birthdays become small instruments. The spoken dates have a softness on the page. 1968, 1971, 1988, 2010, 2016. Each date is a marker, but also a room of its own. You can step into 1988 and see a young woman at a counter. You can step into 2010 and see a family discovering documents. You can step into 2016 and see a name finally returned. Dates do not carry emotion by themselves, yet emotion gathers around them. Families remember the year someone left. Investigators remember the year a case changed. Researchers remember the moment a match began to make sense. The Lori Ruff case is full of such dates, each one modest, until placed beside the others. The role of the Social Security investigator is worth holding gently too. Many people imagine cold case work only as police work, but identity cases often involve agencies that maintain the skeleton of public life. Social Security records, vital records, motor vehicle records, court records, and marriage records all become part of the search. You can see how many desks a single life touches. When one of those records is false at the root, the effects can travel quietly. It does not always look like chaos. Often it looks normal, because the system has accepted the earlier step. Lori's identity worked because enough offices recognized it. The later investigation worked because patient people questioned the steps after the fact. You can think of it as unsewing. A life under a false identity is stitched into many places. To understand it, investigators do not tear the fabric apart. They find the thread and pull carefully, inch by inch. The Lori Ruff case required that kind of unsewing, from Ruff back to Kennedy, from Kennedy back to Turner, and from Turner toward the unknown woman who became Kimberly again. The thread did not lead straight to Kimberly at first. It frayed at Becky Sue Turner. That could have ended the inquiry in frustration, but instead it clarified the problem. The person using the certificate had chosen a child whose record could be obtained. That choice suggested planning, or at least determined action. It also suggested that the true origin might be nowhere near the stolen record. So the investigators widened their thinking. If the certificate came from Washington, Lori did not have to come from Washington. If the identification was issued in Idaho, she did not have to be from Idaho. If the legal name change occurred in Texas, she did not have to be from Texas. You can feel the map loosening. The answer could be almost anywhere. That looseness is exhausting in an investigation. A narrow search gives comfort, even when it is hard. A wide search asks more from everyone. More records, more possibilities, more false starts, more names that almost fit and then do not. The Lori Ruff case spent years in that wide space, where almost anything seemed possible and almost nothing could be proved. Public attention sometimes helps in that wide space, because someone may recognize a face or detail. But public attention can also scatter the work, adding guesses faster than investigators can check them. The calm file must stay calm. You take in tips, sort them, compare them, and let the unsupported ones fall away. The desk remains the desk, even when the world outside grows noisy. The eventual use of genealogy brought the search back from everywhere to somewhere. DNA matches do that. They narrow the possible families, then the possible branches, then the possible individuals. You can picture a huge map folding inward, panel by panel, until one town, one family, and one missing woman come into view. The motion is quiet, but profound. Kimberly McLean's recovery as Lori's original identity was profound because it answered the public question and a family question at once. It gave the mystery a birth name. It explained why no one searching only for Lori's early records could find a childhood. Lori's childhood was not under Lori. It had been waiting under Kimberly in another part of the country and another part of time. Once that is understood, the earlier confusion becomes almost painfully logical. Of course, Lori's background seemed absent. Of course, her documents began too late. Of course, the stolen certificate created a false first step. You can see the structure clearly only after the answer arrives. Before that, every missing piece looks like a different kind of darkness. That is why hindsight should be gentle. It is easy, after the fact, to think the path was obvious. It was not. The investigators did not begin with Kimberly's name in their hands. They began with contradictions, grief, and documents that pointed to a child who had died decades earlier. They had to work from confusion toward clarity, not from clarity backward. You and I, sitting with the file tonight, have the advantage of knowing where the path leads. That means we have a responsibility to tell it slowly and fairly. We can see the pattern, but we should not pretend the pattern was visible from the beginning. The people inside the investigation were feeling their way through dim rooms. Those dim rooms had real textures, paper clips leaving rust marks, manila folders soft at the corners, old photographs sticking slightly to plastic sleeves, a legal seal catching light like a dull coin, a computer fan whirring during a late search. These are the materials of patient detection, and they suit the Lori Ruff case better than any sharp music or dramatic pause ever could. The case's atmosphere is not about fear, it is about quiet bewilderment. A family thought they knew a woman's name. A record said otherwise. Another record said something even stranger. Then science and genealogy finally returned a buried truth. The story moves through bewilderment toward recognition, but it never becomes simple enough to close every drawer. You can leave some drawers closed for now. The one labeled motive remains difficult. The one labeled emotional history remains only partly filled. The one labeled final years contains pain we do not need to describe sharply. Our work tonight is to follow the evidence that solved the identity, and to do so in a way that lets every person remain human. That includes Becky Sue Turner. Her name is often mentioned because it became part of Lori's constructed identity. But Becky was not merely a clue. She was a child whose record should have belonged only to her brief life and her family's memory. The use of her birth certificate brought her name into another mystery, and we can acknowledge that with care. In old identity cases, the records of deceased children were sometimes exploited because systems did not always cross-check birth and death in real time. That vulnerability was quiet and administrative. It did not require a scene from fiction. It required access, timing, and a system built on trust. The Lori Ruff case shows how such trust could be used to step into a new name. You can imagine the Vital Records Office as it might have been, not in exact detail, but in texture, forms in trays, a counter worn smooth where many hands had rested, a clerk retrieving a certificate without knowing what future story it would enter. The whole moment may have taken only minutes. Its consequences lasted decades. Decades are made of ordinary minutes. That is one reason this case feels so haunting in a soft way. A few minutes obtaining a record, a few minutes filing a name change, a few minutes placing documents in a lockbox, then years of life built around those acts. You can see how small administrative moments can become load-bearing beams. When the identity was finally solved, those beams were exposed. People could see the construction and understand how it had held. That does not mean they could understand why the builder began. The Lori Ruff case remains, in that sense, a house with its frame visible and one locked room still unentered. We walk carefully through the rooms we can enter. The solved identity also changed how people searched old memories. Once Kimberly McLean's name was known, those who had known Kimberly could connect their memories to Lori's later story. A face might be compared, a date might be reconsidered. A disappearance once standing alone could be joined to the Texas mystery. You can feel how the past rearranges when the right name arrives. That rearrangement can be both comforting and painful. Comforting because uncertainty has edges now. Painful because the answer confirms that the missing person lived and died under another name, beyond reach. The mind may revisit old years differently. Holidays, birthdays, and ordinary afternoons may take on new meaning. Evidence solves a file, but families still have to live with what the solution gives them. The Lori Ruff case is therefore not only about weird evidence. It is about the patience of everyone left with partial knowledge. The family that found the lockbox had partial knowledge. Investigators had partial knowledge. Kimberly's birth family had partial knowledge. Genealogists worked by turning partial knowledge into testable paths. No one began with the whole. You can hold that as a gentle lesson. Most truth arrives partially. We gather what we can, compare it with care, and allow the picture to sharpen slowly. If we demand the whole image at once, we may miss the small lines that make it possible. The Lori Ruff case sharpened because people kept faith with the small lines. One of those lines was the legal record of the name Lori Erica Kennedy. Another was the marriage record that made Lori Erica Ruff. Another was the death record of Becky Sue Turner, which proved the borrowed identity could not be genuine. Another was the genetic relationship, pointing back to Kimberly McLean. The solution lay not in any one line, but in their convergence. Convergence is a calm word. It suggests streams meeting without force. In this case, the streams were paper, memory, and biology. They came from different directions and met at the same woman. You can see them on the desk as separate folders, then slowly overlapping. When the overlap held, the unknown woman had a name again. The night deepens around that thought. The file is still open, but it feels less restless now. The central confusion has been named, and the remaining questions can sit without being chased. You rest your eyes for a moment on the edge of the page, where the paper is slightly darker from handling. So many hands may have touched these copies before the answer came. Handling is another quiet theme in the Lori Ruff case. Someone handled the birth certificate. Someone handled the court forms. Someone handled the lockbox. Someone handled DNA results and family trees. Evidence changes meaning depending on whose hands hold it and what question they are asking. A document that once enabled concealment later enabled recognition. That reversal is almost the heart of the story. The very papers meant to support the new identity became the trail back through it. The lockbox, perhaps meant to keep secrets contained, kept them from being lost. The borrowed name, once a mask, became a clue because it could be disproved. The system that allowed the reinvention also preserved enough records to unwind it. You can let the case teach that without forcing a moral too neatly. Human beings are complicated. Systems are imperfect. Records can both fail and help. Families can be hurt and still seek truth. Investigators can be patient and still never learn everything. The Lori Ruff case holds all of these at once, under a quiet light. As we continue through the file, we can spend more time with the transition from Kimberly to Lori, because that transition is where the evidence becomes most delicate. It is not a single moment we can fully see. It is a period suggested by documents. Kimberly leaves. A new identity appears. The space between them is where the private life moved beyond the reach of ordinary records. You can imagine packing a bag, though we do not know what she packed. Clothing folded quickly or carefully, papers kept or discarded, a bus station, a road, an apartment, a borrowed address, or none of those exactly. We must keep such images soft, because they are only possibilities. Still, they help us remember that identity change is lived bodily, not just filed legally. A person who leaves a name behind must still wake up the next morning. She must answer when called, sign forms, remember which story she has told, and build habits around concealment. The new name has to become natural enough for daily life. You can feel how time itself helps, smoothing the first awkwardness until the chosen name feels ordinary to everyone nearby. For Lori, that ordinary surface lasted many years. People knew her as Lori because that is who she was to them. This is important. A later discovery does not make every adult relationship false in a simple way. It makes the foundation hidden. Those who knew her still knew her gestures, moods, routines, and presence. They did not know the beginning. The beginning matters, but it is not the only part of a person. That is why the file should be read with balance. Kimberly McLean was not merely a lost original erased by Lori Ruff. Lori Ruff was not merely a disguise with no human substance. The same person lived through both names, carrying continuity no document could fully show. Evidence struggles with continuity. It excels at fixed points. Name here, date there, address there, relationship there. But the self moves between fixed points, like water between stones. The Lori Ruff case gives us enough stones to trace the stream, but not enough to hear every current under the surface. So we listen carefully where we can. The court record from 1988 is one of those stones. It tells us the new name became official. It does not tell us whether the petitioner felt frightened, relieved, determined, numb, or simply practical. You can read the formal words and feel their limitation. Law can record a change. It cannot record the private weather that made the change necessary to the person seeking it. Private weather may be the gentlest phrase for what we do not know. It lets us acknowledge there was an inner climate without pretending to forecast it after the fact. In the Lori Ruff case, that weather stayed hidden through her life and after it. The documents show the rain on the windows. They do not let us stand inside the room where she first heard it. As the years passed, Lori's constructed identity became layered with real experiences. Marriage was real. Motherhood was real. Conflict was real. Her death in 2010 was real. The later discovery did not turn those experiences into mere cover. It complicated them. You can feel how hard that complication would be for people trying to grieve. Grief usually reaches backward. It asks for childhood stories, old photographs, relatives, places of origin, and the long arc that made a person who they were. In Lori's case, grief reached backward and found a wall of paper. That must have been bewildering. The family did not only lose her, they lost the assumption that they knew the path leading to her. When the lockbox opened, the house must have felt different. Objects that had seemed ordinary may have looked newly uncertain. A document drawer, a story once told, an answer once avoided. You can imagine the air in the room becoming still as people read. Not dramatic stillness, the stillness of minds trying to take in a fact too odd to place. Then came the practical work, because bewilderment alone cannot help. The papers had to be sorted. Names had to be checked, agencies had to be contacted. You can see someone writing lists on a legal pad, perhaps pressing too hard with the pen. Becky Sue Turner, Lori Erica Kennedy, Lori Erica Ruff, unknown birth name. Each line opened another question. The unknown birth name was the hardest line. It represented a person without an accessible beginning. For years, that line resisted. The evidence told investigators there must be another name, but not what it was. You can feel the frustration of that. A door exists. The hinges are visible. The keyhole is visible. The key is nowhere on the table. Genetic genealogy became the key because it did not depend on Lori's chosen records. It depended on inherited patterns she could not rename. Not in a mystical way, and not in a harsh way. Simply as biology. We all carry traces of people before us, and in this case those traces formed a path back through the silence. That path required comparison with living relatives, public records, and careful inference. You can imagine the family tree growing wider before it grew narrower, with names branching across the screen. The researcher must have had moments of uncertainty, then moments of recognition. A branch fits, another branch fails. A missing daughter appears in the right generation. The quiet work continues. When Kimberly McLean's name came into focus, the evidence from the lockbox did not become irrelevant. It became even more meaningful. Now, the false documents could be placed within a true biography. The borrowed certificate showed the method. The name change showed the legal transformation. The adult records showed the life after transformation. The DNA showed the original family line. You can see how the solved identity turned scattered objects into a coherent archive. Before, they were strange fragments. After, they were evidence of a journey from one name to another. The Lori Ruff case, in that sense, is a reminder that evidence often waits for context. A fact can sit unexplained for years until another fact arrives to give it shape. Context is quiet but powerful. A handwritten note means little until you know who wrote it, when, and why it might matter. A certificate means little until you know whether the person using it had a right to it. A name means little until you know which life it belongs to. The investigators kept gathering context until Lori and Kimberly could be understood as one person. Even then, the emotional context remained incomplete. That is the part we carry carefully through the next pages. There may be records from Kimberly's earlier life. There may be memories from relatives. There may be accounts of why she left or what tensions existed. But unless the evidence clearly speaks, we keep our voice low and our claims modest. The unknown deserves manners. Manners may seem like a strange word in a cold case, but it fits. There are manners in how we handle the dead, how we discuss families, and how we speak about choices made under pressures we may not fully understand. The Lori Ruff case invites curiosity, but it also asks for restraint. You can be attentive without being intrusive. The desk lamp has warmed the papers now. The room feels softer than when we began. You may notice that the case's strangeness no longer feels sharp. It feels worn at the edges, like something held and reconsidered for a long time. That is what patient detective work does. It takes the sharpness out of mystery and replaces it with careful understanding. Careful understanding tells us that Lori's identity was solved through an unusual combination of clues. The The dead child's birth certificate revealed a false root. The name change records traced the construction of the adult identity. The lockbox preserved the trail. Genetic genealogy restored the true name. Each piece alone was incomplete. Together, they answered the central question. But after an answer, people must decide what to do with it. Investigators close some lines of inquiry. Families absorb new information. Public interest quiets or changes shape. The file is not the same file anymore. You can almost see a new label placed on it. Not unknown woman, but Kimberly McLean, also known as Lori Ruff. The label is longer, but kinder. A longer label can hold more truth. It can admit that one life had multiple names without reducing any of them to a footnote. It can allow the birth family and the married family to appear in the same record. It can tell future readers where to begin. In a case once defined by concealment, accurate labeling becomes a small act of repair. Repair is not the same as undoing. Nothing in the investigation could undo the years Kimberly was gone from her family, or the shock Lori's in-laws felt when the box was opened. Nothing could give Lori the chance to explain, but repair can still happen in limited ways. A name restored, a record corrected, a mystery narrowed, a family given something solid after years of air. You can rest your hand near that solid thing. The name Kimberly McLean is solid. The use of Becky Sue Turner's certificate is solid. The legal change to Lori Erica Kennedy is solid. The later life as Lori Ruff is solid. The reasons are less solid. We can distinguish between stone and mist, and that distinction keeps the story honest. Honesty is restful in its own way. It does not promise more than it has. It does not turn speculation into certainty for the sake of a cleaner ending. The Lori Ruff case can be calm because we are not trying to force it into a shape it never had. We are following the shape the evidence actually made. The evidence made a long curve. It began with Kimberly, curved through Becky's borrowed record, passed into Lori Erica Kennedy, continued into Lori Ruff, and then curved back after death toward Kimberly again. You can picture that curve on a page, drawn in pencil rather than ink, because parts of it remain delicate. The line is visible now, but it was not always visible. During the years when the line was hidden, Lori lived within it. That thought is worth keeping close. She was not waiting to become a case. She was living, struggling, making choices, perhaps regretting some and defending others. People often become mysteries only after death, when the private logic of their lives can no longer be explained by the person who held it. That is one of the sorrows of posthumous investigation. It can recover facts, but not voice. It can identify a woman, but not ask her why she chose silence at a particular moment. You can feel the absence of that voice in the Lori Ruff case. It is not a dramatic absence. It is the quiet gap after every answered document. Because her voice is absent, we must be cautious with ours. We can describe the evidence. We can describe the investigative path. We can describe the impact of the discovery. We can avoid making Lori into a symbol too simple to be true. She was Lori. She was known and unknown both at once, to different people in different years. The file holds that complexity better than a quick retelling does. A quick retelling races from lockbox to solved identity, as if the only point were surprise. A slower reading lets you feel the administrative steps, the family waiting, the researchers comparing, and the moral care needed around every unknown motive. That is why we stay here, with the pages, and let the case unfold at its proper pace. There is still more to notice in the use of a deceased child's record. It shows knowledge of a loophole, or at least awareness that such records could be used. Lori, or Kimberly at that stage, may have learned this from research, rumor, or practical instruction. We do not know. But the act itself suggests deliberation. A new identity rarely assembles itself by accident. Deliberation can coexist with desperation. A person may plan carefully because she feels she has no other safe option, or because she is determined to separate from a past. or for reasons more tangled than any single phrase. The Lori Ruff case does not let us choose confidently. You can hold deliberation in one hand and uncertainty in the other. Both belong. The legal system provided the next layer. A name change is not inherently suspicious. People change names for marriage, family reasons, personal safety, preference, faith, and countless ordinary purposes. That ordinary legitimacy is what made the Lori Erica Kennedy name durable. Once granted, it did not carry a visible warning that the earlier identity had been borrowed. This is where context again becomes essential. The name change only looks strange because of Becky Sue Turner's record behind it and Kimberly McLean's absence beyond it. Without those, Lori Erica Kennedy might appear as any other legal name change in a busy court ledger. Evidence does not always announce its significance. It waits for neighboring facts. You can imagine a ledger page with many names, each representing a private reason. Most will never become mysteries. One did. The clerk could not have known which line would later be studied by investigators, family members, and strangers trying to understand. The ordinariness of the page gives the case its hush. Great consequences can hide among routine entries. Routine entries are the language of bureaucracy. Birth, death, marriage, name change, address, identification. In the Lori Ruff case, those entries form a kind of quiet poem, though no one intended it. A birth that was not hers, a death that proved it, a name changed, a marriage recorded, a death that opened the box, a true birth name restored. We can hear that pattern without making it theatrical. It is simply the rhythm of records trying belatedly to tell the truth. You turn the page, the file offers another official line, you turn another. The silence between the lines grows meaningful. Patient detective work often means listening to those silences until they begin to separate into different kinds. There is the silence of missing records. There is the silence of refused questions. There is the silence of someone no longer alive to explain. There is the silence before a database match. The Lori Ruff case contains all of these, and each one has a different texture. Some are smooth and blank. Some are heavy. Some are only temporary, waiting for the next tool. The temporary silence ended when Kimberly McLean was identified, but the heavier silence, the why, remained. We do not need to solve that tonight. In fact, it may be kinder not to pretend. The value of the case lies partly in watching how much can be learned without crossing the line into invention. You can sit beside an unanswered question and still honor the answered one. The answered one matters deeply. Who was Lori Ruff? She was Kimberly McLean. The evidence that solved that began with odd, preserved documents and ended with genetic genealogy. That sentence is simple, but behind it are years of unease, care, research, and comparison. The simplicity is earned, not given. Earned simplicity has a different feel from easy simplicity. It feels like a desk finally cleared after a long evening, not because the work was small, but because each paper found its place. The Lori Ruff case reached that kind of partial order. The documents did not vanish. They became understandable. The name did not remain lost. It returned. And as the name returned, the case became less about the strangeness of disguise and more about the human need to be known truthfully. Even when someone tried hard not to be known in one way, there were others who needed truth for their own peace. That tension cannot be solved by paperwork alone. It can only be acknowledged, gently and without triumph. Triumph would sound wrong here. The identification was a success for investigators, but it came after death and sorrow. The right tone is closer to relief, mixed with sadness. You can feel it in the room, like the moment after a long phone call when no one speaks immediately. Something has been answered. Something else has become real. The file remains open under your hand, and the next pages carry us further into the patient work of putting names, records, and families back into relation. That relation between records and families is where the Lori Ruff case becomes especially tender. A record can be corrected in an office, but a family has to absorb the correction in the quiet rooms of ordinary life. You can imagine a phone call placed after years of uncertainty, a voice explaining that Kimberly had been found, though not in the way anyone would have wanted. The words would have to move slowly, because some truths need space around them before they can be heard. The investigators and genealogists could provide the facts, but they could not provide an easier past. That is one of the humbling parts of cold case work. You can solve a question that has troubled people for years and still leave them with grief that does not become smaller right away. The Lori Ruff case gave Kimberly McLean's family an answer. Yet the answer carried the knowledge of all the years she had lived under another name. You can picture someone sitting at a kitchen table after such news, with the room suddenly too quiet. A cup may sit untouched, a clock may keep its old steady sound. The mind begins returning to remembered moments, perhaps the day Kimberly left, perhaps a birthday, perhaps a photograph, kept because throwing it away would have felt like giving up. The answer has arrived, but it does not erase the waiting. For the Ruff family, the same answer would have settled a different kind of uncertainty. Lori had not appeared from nowhere, though it may have felt that way after the lockbox was opened. She had come from a real family, a real childhood, a real name. That knowledge can soften one edge of confusion while sharpening another. You know who she was, and then you wonder why she never said. The file does not answer that second wonder. It offers signs, not certainty. It offers the borrowed birth certificate, the formal name change, the guarded conversations, and the long silence. You can lay those signs on the table, but they will not arrange themselves into a full confession. They remain evidence of concealment, and concealment is not the same as explanation. In patient detective work, that difference matters every time. You might know that someone hid a past, but not what that past felt like from inside. You might know the route they took through official records, but not what they feared, hoped, or regretted while taking it. The Lori Ruff case asks us to stay close to what can be known and gentle near what cannot, so we return to the concrete things: the certificate, the court order, the lockbox, the DNA comparison, the names. When a case contains mystery, concrete objects keep the telling from drifting into air. You can hold a certificate in a sleeve. You can read a court stamp. You can trace a family tree branch. You can place a name in the right column after years of it being absent. The strangeness of the evidence lies in how unemotional it looks at first glance. A form does not tell you it is carrying a secret. A name change order does not whisper that another family is somewhere beyond the page. Even the lockbox, closed and waiting, would have looked like any other small container of private papers. It is only when you know the sequence that every object seems to glow faintly. That faint glow is not excitement. It is significance in the Lori Ruff case. Significance settled slowly over plain things. A birth certificate became evidence of identity theft. A legal name became evidence of reinvention. A family tree became evidence of origin. The case teaches us to look at ordinary items with patience, because ordinary items often remember what people cannot or will not say. You can imagine the person sorting Lori's belongings after her death, perhaps not expecting the past to open. Sorting after loss is already difficult. Clothes, receipts, papers, small household objects, all of them make a life feel both present and unreachable. Then a locked container appears, or a hidden set of documents, and the work of mourning is interrupted by the work of understanding. That interruption would have been heavy. The family was not merely discovering old keepsakes. They were discovering that the person they knew had been living under a constructed identity. You can feel the disorientation of that without needing to raise the volume. It is the quiet shock of realizing that a familiar name has a hidden basement beneath it. Basements are good images for old cases. They are cool, dim, and full of things stored for reasons people sometimes forget. You pull one box from a shelf, and dust lifts in the beam of a flashlight. The label may be wrong, or missing, or written by someone no longer alive. The Lori Ruff case has that basement feeling, where every object asks to be carried upstairs and examined in warmer light. Once the objects were brought into that light, investigators had to decide what belonged where. Documents can mislead if they are read alone. A birth certificate used by Lori did not mean she was Becky. A name change did not mean the original name was genuine. A marriage record did not reveal a childhood. Each document had to be understood, not as a final answer, but as part of a chain. Chains can be followed, but they can also be broken. The chain from Lori Ruff to Lori Erica Kennedy held because of legal records. The chain from Lori Erica Kennedy to Becky Sue Turner broke because Becky had died as a child. That break was painful but useful. It told investigators the trail had been deliberately attached to a name that could not speak for itself. A deceased child's record can become vulnerable in systems that rely on separate archives. Birth in one drawer, death in another, application in a third, and no automatic conversation between them. You can see how the world of paper made space for such a thing. It was not a world without rules. It was a world where rules depended on people and offices being connected in ways they often were not. This is one of the quiet historical lessons inside the Lori Ruff case. The tools of one era become the vulnerabilities of another. Paper records made sense for their time, but they could be slow, local, and trusting. Later digital systems made cross-checking easier, though never perfect. The case sits between those worlds, born from paper and solved with data. You can hear that contrast almost as sound, the thump of a stamp in the old office, the muted click of a keyboard in the later search, the rustle of a folder beside the soft hum of a computer. The Lori Ruff case moved from one soundscape to the other, and the answer came only after both had done their part. The official paper trail gave the mystery shape. Genetic genealogy gave it direction. Without the paper trail, investigators might not have understood the depth of the false identity. Without genealogy, they might not have reached Kimberly. The two methods did not compete. They met like old and new roads joining near a quiet town. As you sit with this part of the file, you may notice how much of the work depends on comparison. Compare one name to another. Compare one date to another. Compare one family branch to another. Compare a remembered disappearance to a constructed identity's first appearance. The case is not solved by staring at one fact until it changes. It is solved by letting facts speak to one another. That is why patience is more than waiting. Patience is active. It means returning to the same material with better tools, clearer questions, and enough humility to admit that the first reading may have missed something. The Lori Ruff case rewarded that active patience. It did not give its answer to curiosity alone. It gave it to careful comparison. The comparison between Lori's timeline and Kimberly's absence was one of the final meaningful alignments. Kimberly left home as a young woman. Lori's created identity emerged afterward. The ages fit. The genealogical relationships fit. The missing person and the unknown woman began to occupy the same outline. You can feel the quiet relief when an outline stops wavering. But even when the outline steadies, the interior can remain unlit. We know the external movement from Kimberly to Lori, but not the inward movement. We do not know the exact thought that made a young woman decide to separate from her name so completely. We do not know whether the choice felt temporary at first, or permanent from the beginning. We do not know when the new name began to feel like the only one she could answer to. Those questions are powerful because they are human, not because they are sensational. Many people understand, in smaller ways, the wish to start over. A new city, a new job, a new way of being seen. Lori's reinvention was far more complete, and it crossed legal and ethical lines through the use of Becky's record. But the emotional idea of escape is not foreign to ordinary life. That recognition should make us more careful, not less. When a case touches a universal feeling, it becomes tempting to project our own reasons into it. You might imagine what would make you leave, and then accidentally call that Lori's reason. A patient reading resists this. It says I can understand the shape of wanting distance, but I cannot claim to know her weather. The file stays honest when it separates sympathy from certainty. We can feel compassion for Kimberly, for Lori, for Becky's family, for the Ruff family, and for Kimberly's birth family, all at once. Compassion does not require us to simplify the facts. It lets us hold the discomfort without turning anyone into a flat figure in a puzzle. If you were reading the file in an archive, you might place slips of paper beside the main documents. One slip for verified records, one for remembered accounts, one for uncertain interpretations. The desk would become a landscape of caution. This is the kind of care the Lori Ruff case needs. Every category kept distinct, every name spoken with respect. The name Becky Sue Turner should not be swallowed by the mechanics of the case. Her record was used, but she was a person first, a child whose brief life belonged to her own family. In telling the Lori Ruff case, we can let Becky's name remain gentle and separate. The document mattered to the investigation, but the child was not merely a tool in someone else's story. Kimberly McLean's name also deserves that separation. Before she became Lori, she was not an abstract missing identity. She was a daughter, a young person, someone remembered. The recovery of her name restored the case's first human anchor. You can feel how different that is from simply solving an alias. It returns the story to people who knew her before the papers changed. Lori Ruff, too, should not be reduced to the alias. That was the name under which she lived adult years, formed relationships, and became a mother. People who knew Lori knew a real person, even if they did not know her origin. This is one of the subtle truths in identity cases. A false document can support a real life. The legal route may be wrong, while the lived experience remains real and consequential. You can sit with that complexity as the night deepens. The lamp throws a small circle of light, and beyond it, the room is soft. The file contains contradictions, but they do not need to be resolved into one harsh statement. Lori concealed. Kimberly disappeared. Becky's record was misused. Families were hurt. Investigators persisted. A name returned. All of those can be true together. The strange evidence that solved the Lori Ruff case worked because it preserved contradiction. If the lockbox had contained only clean records under Lori's adult name, there might have been no trail. If it had contained only random notes, there might have been too little structure. Instead, it held enough contradiction to be useful. It showed that the story Lori lived under did not begin where it claimed to begin. Contradiction is often where investigation starts. A date that cannot be right, a name that belongs elsewhere, a document that points to a person who cannot possibly be the one using it. The detective does not need to become alarmed. The detective needs to become attentive. You notice the contradiction, steady the page, and ask what it allows you to rule out. Ruling out Becky Sue Turner was a major step. It closed the false beginning and made room for the real one. It also showed that the person who became Lori had access to a method of identity construction known in earlier decades. That does not tell us where she learned it. It tells us only that she used it successfully enough to build a life. The success of that constructed identity may have made later questions feel threatening to Lori. If your life rests on a concealed origin, even a casual family question can feel like someone touching a load-bearing wall. You can imagine why she might have shut down conversations quickly. The documents were stable as long as nobody tried to go too far back. But families naturally go back. They ask about grandparents, holidays, childhood towns, old recipes, school memories, family medical histories. These questions are ordinary forms of intimacy. They say, "Let me know where you came from, so I can know you more fully." Lori's inability or refusal to answer them created distance, and over time, That distance became part of how others experienced her. That distance later became evidence, but during life it was likely just painful confusion. A relative may have felt excluded. A spouse may have felt mistrusted. Someone may have stopped asking because the answer was never worth the hurt. You can see how a secret protects one person while slowly injuring the bonds around her. The file records the secret. The family remembers the injury. Again, we hold this without sharpness. Lori may have felt trapped by the identity she built. Once a secret grows large enough, revealing it can seem impossible, even when keeping it causes damage. The longer it lasts, the more it gathers consequences. By the time many years have passed, the truth no longer concerns only the past. It threatens the entire present. That is one reason the lockbox feels so heavy. It contained the beginning of the secret, and by remaining hidden, helped the secret endure. Yet it also contained the materials that would later undo the secrecy. You can imagine Lori placing those papers away, perhaps with relief, perhaps with fear, perhaps with no clear feeling at all. The box became a quiet witness. Objects that witness without speaking are central to old mysteries. A suitcase, a ledger, a photograph, a key. In the Lori Ruff case, the lockbox joins that family of objects, not because it is ornate, but because it survived the years with its contents intact. The metal, the latch, the stored papers, all of it became part of a delayed conversation. The delayed conversation involved agencies, family members, and eventually a forensic genealogist. Each participant entered at a different point. The family found the strangeness. Investigators traced the documents. Genealogical work supplied the biological bridge. No single person held the whole case from the beginning. It passed from hand to hand, and each hand added something. That passing matters. Patient detective work is often collaborative in ways the public does not see. One person preserves a detail. Another recognizes its importance. Another has access to a database. Another knows how to build a family tree. Another remembers a missing relative. The solution feels singular when announced, but it is usually braided from many small efforts. The Lori Ruff case is braided that way. Paper records, agency inquiry, family persistence, public attention, and genetic genealogy all twist together. If one strand had broken, the answer might have come later, or differently, or not at all. You can appreciate the braid without needing to tug at it. It held because enough people kept their part. Public attention likely helped keep the mystery alive. When a case is written about, discussed, and revisited, it remains available to someone who might recognize a pattern or bring a new tool. But public attention must be gentle to be useful. A mystery involving real families is not a game board. The Lori Ruff case gained attention because it was unusual, but it deserved care because it was personal. You and I keep that care by returning to the human stakes. The question was never only, how did she do it? It was also, who was missing from the beginning of the story? It was also who was missing from the beginning of the story. It was, who deserved to know? It was, what happens when one person's hidden past becomes several families' unanswered grief? Those questions move more slowly than the mechanics, and they should. The mechanics, however, are still important. They show us how the strange evidence solved the identity. The use of Becky Sue Turner's birth certificate created an official but false starting point. The legal name change to Lori Erica Kennedy gave that false start a new form. The later marriage created the name Lori Ruff. The lockbox preserved the sequence, and DNA later restored the true origin. You can feel the investigation moving along that sequence like a hand following a seam in cloth. The seam does not explain who made the garment, but it shows how pieces were joined. If you follow it long enough, you may find where the pattern began. In Lori's case, the seam led first to a borrowed identity, then stopped until genealogy found another way through. Genealogy often feels like working in a quiet attic. Old names, family branches, dates of birth, marriage notices, places people moved. and the little paper signs of ordinary lives. You sought them patiently, with dust in the air and afternoon light slanting across the floorboards. The Lori Ruff case, though modern in some tools, has that attic feeling because it depends on ancestry and remembered kinship. A family tree can be both beautiful and difficult. It gives belonging, but it also reveals absence. A missing branch is not just a blank on a chart. It is a person unaccounted for, a story interrupted. When Kimberly's branch connected to Lori, the chart became more complete, but the interruption did not vanish. It became legible. Legibility is a quiet gift. Before the identification, Lori's past could not be read clearly. Afterward, the beginning could be read, at least in outline. Kimberly McLean had a birth name, a family, a place in a tree. The adult identity no longer floated unattached. It could be placed. Placement is not the same as peace, but it is closer than confusion. The old paper documents also became more legible after the identification. The name change no longer looked like an isolated oddity. It became an event in Kimberly's life after leaving home. The stolen certificate no longer looked like an impossible origin. It became the method by which the new identity began. Context did not soften the wrongness of misusing the record, but it made the sequence understandable. Understanding a sequence is one of the first comforts investigators can offer. Not emotional comfort, exactly, but structural comfort. This happened before that. This document led to that one. This name connects here. In a file full of uncertainty, structure lets people breathe. The Lori Ruff case, once structured, became less formless, even though the deepest motive stayed unclear. You can imagine the first written timeline after the identification. Kimberly's birth entered at the top. Her departure from home entered later. Then the Becky Sue Turner certificate, the name change, the adult life, the death, the discovery, the genetic solution. The page would still be sad, but it would no longer be a blank beginning attached to a confusing end. That is why a true name matters so much. Without it, the timeline starts in the middle. With it, the story can be placed in order. A name gives the first page back to the file. You can feel that restoration under your fingertips as you turn from Lori's documents to Kimberly's origin. The paper is still paper, but it carries a different kind of light. The case also shows how a person can be both hidden and traceable. Lori hid her birth identity from those around her, yet she remained traceable through systems she could not fully escape. Official documents recorded her constructed path. Biological inheritance recorded her original connections. Memory recorded the absence. Hiddenness was real, but it was not absolute. Very little hiddenness is absolute, given enough time and preservation. A receipt, a stamp, a cousin match, a remembered date, each can become a small opening. That thought can feel unsettling in some contexts, but in cold case work, it can be a mercy. It means the lost may still be named. It means a mystery can wait without dying completely. The Lori Ruff case waited in that way. It did not stay fresh in the sense of new leads every day. It stayed alive because the core contradiction remained unresolved and because people cared enough to keep asking. You can picture the file resting for long stretches, then being opened again, each opening a small refusal to let the question disappear. There is something deeply human in that refusal. We are creatures who name, remember, and connect. When a person's name does not fit, or a disappearance has no answer, the mind returns. Not always loudly. Sometimes only at night, or on anniversaries, or when a box is moved from one shelf to another. The Lori Ruff case lived in those returns. You may find, as you listen, that the case's pace has begun to feel like the pace of archival work itself. Lift the folder, read the label, check the date, place a note, close the folder, return tomorrow. This rhythm suits a sleep narration because it asks for attention without alarm. It lets the mind follow a path while the body rests. The path now bends toward the people who did the identifying work. A forensic genealogist approaches a case like this not by guessing at the most dramatic answer, but by building from matches outward. Shared DNA points to relatives. Relatives point to common ancestors. Common ancestors point to branches. Branches point to possible missing individuals. The process is slow, but it has a graceful logic. You can imagine the genealogist keeping careful notes beside the screen. This match belongs on the maternal side. That branch moved to Pennsylvania. This child was born in the right year. This family had a daughter named Kimberly. Each note is small. Together they begin to make a corridor through the uncertainty. At the far end, the name waits. When the name Kimberly McLean emerged, it had to be confirmed through the alignment of evidence. A genealogical theory is not enough by itself. It must fit the documents, the age, the known timeline, and the disappearance. In the Lori Ruff case, the fit was strong enough to answer the identity question publicly. You can feel the careful satisfaction of that, restrained and respectful. Careful satisfaction is different from celebration. Celebration would ignore the sadness of the outcome, but satisfaction belongs to the work. It is right to acknowledge that patient investigation succeeded. It succeeded in restoring a name that had been hidden for decades. It succeeded in correcting the public record. It succeeded in giving families an answer, even a painful one. As we follow that success, we should also remember the role of chance. If the lockbox had not been found, if the papers had not been kept, if DNA databases had not developed, if the right relatives had not appeared in the right patterns, the answer might have remained out of reach. Cold cases often depend on both diligence and chance. The art is being ready when chance opens a door. Readiness looks quiet from the outside. It looks like organized files, preserved evidence, open questions, and people willing to revisit old material. In the Lori Ruff case, readiness meant that when genealogical tools became useful, there was still a mystery with enough supporting information to guide the search. The old documents and new science could speak because the old documents were still there. That is why evidence preservation is not glamorous, but essential. A folder stored correctly may seem unimportant for years. Then one day, it allows a question to be asked in a new way. You can think of preservation as a promise made to the future. We do not know what this will mean yet, but we will keep it safe until someone can ask better questions. The Lori Ruff case was waiting for better questions. Early questions asked, "Who is Becky Sue Turner, and why is her name here?" Later questions asked, "What identity did this woman construct?" Finally, genealogy asked, "Who are this woman's biological relatives, and where does she fit among them?" Each question was better suited to its moment. Together, they moved the case forward. The progression is calming because it shows that not knowing is not always permanent. Sometimes not knowing means the right tool has not arrived. Sometimes it means the right record has not been connected. Sometimes it means the right record has not been connected. The paperwork path is exact enough to trace Becky Sue Turner to Lori Erica Kennedy to Lori Erica Ruff. The emotional cause is incomplete. The private reason is incomplete. A mature telling lets those two realities sit side by side, without asking one to cancel the other. You can imagine writing those words in the margin, exact here, incomplete here. It is a useful habit for any old case. It prevents the mind from overreaching. It also prevents despair, because incompleteness does not erase progress. The Lori Ruff case made extraordinary progress. It moved from nameless uncertainty to a restored identity, and that is a meaningful distance. Meaningful distance is not always measured in miles, though this case crossed many. Pennsylvania, Washington, Idaho, Texas. The geography is wide, but the deeper distance was between the person Lori appeared to be and the person Kimberly had been. The investigation crossed that distance through records, not roads, and through kinship, not direct memory. Still, Roads belong to the atmosphere of the case. A young woman leaving home, offices in different states, Texas neighborhoods, records traveling through mail or databases. You can picture highways at dusk, motel lamps, bus station benches, office parking lots after rain. We do not know every route Kimberly took, but movement hums beneath the known facts. Movement also makes reinvention easier. In a new place, fewer people ask old questions. In a new state, an unfamiliar name sounds no different from any other unfamiliar name. A person can become known by the story she offers, and if the story is sparse, others may accept the sparseness as personality. Lori's guardedness may have become just part of who people thought she was. Only later did the guardedness become evidence of something larger. That is another pattern in cold cases. A detail that once seemed personal becomes investigative after new information appears. The meaning changes with context. You can think back to a conversation and hear it differently. A silence that once felt frustrating may later seem like a door deliberately held shut. Families often replay those moments after a discovery. Did I miss something? Should I have asked more? Should I have asked less? The Lori Ruff case may have left people with those difficult loops of thought. We can be gentle with them. Hindsight is not a fair judge of people living without the information we have now. They did not know they were inside a future mystery. The investigators, too, had to avoid unfair hindsight. They had to work from evidence, not from the feeling that someone should have known. Systems allowed the identity to be built. People accepted official documents. That was not irrational. Official documents exist so ordinary life can proceed without everyone becoming an investigator at every doorway. This trust is necessary, even though it can be misused. The Lori Ruff case sits in that uneasy truth. A society needs records people can rely on. It also needs safeguards when records are exploited. The case is a quiet reminder that every system has a human edge, and at that edge, a determined person may slip through. But the same system, improved and combined with other methods, can later repair the record. The birth certificate trail showed the misuse. The court record preserved the change. The marriage and death records preserved the adult identity. Genealogy restored the origin. In a strange way, the records that failed at first became part of the correction later. You can feel the circularity there, but it is not a neat circle. It is more like a path through trees that eventually returns near the road, with leaves on your coat and the air cooler than when you started. The Lori Ruff case returns to Kimberly McLean, but it brings with it all the years under another name. The return is real, and the journey remains. The journey's emotional center may be the question of belonging. Where did Lori belong? To the family that raised Kimberly, to the family she joined as Lori, to the documents she created, to the child whose record she used. Not all in the same way, of course, but the case touches each form of belonging: legal, biological, emotional, and mistaken. Belonging can be complicated by secrecy. If you hide your origin, you may gain control over what others know, but you may also make full belonging harder. People cannot welcome what they are not allowed to see. Lori's secrecy may have protected something, yet it also isolated her from the ordinary exchange of family history. That isolation is one of the case's quiet sorrows. You can hear that sorrow in the unanswered family questions. Not loud, not dramatic, just the soft ache of missing context. What were your parents' names? Where are your childhood photos? Who knew you when you were small? These are tender questions in a family. When they cannot be answered, the silence becomes part of the relationship. The Lori Ruff case, once solved in identity, allowed some of those questions to be answered after the fact. Parents' names, birth name, origin, family tree, but after the fact has its own sadness. The answers could no longer become ordinary conversation with Lori. They could only become knowledge about her. There is a difference. and the file seems to know it. Knowledge about a person is cooler than knowledge shared with a person. It sits on paper. It can be accurate, even necessary, but it does not laugh, correct you, add a detail, or soften a hard assumption. Lori was no longer there to say, "Yes, that was me," or "No, you have misunderstood." The investigation could identify her, but not restore dialogue. That is why we keep the narration slow. Speed would flatten the sadness. A fast version would make the weird evidence the star and leave the person behind. But in this quieter telling, the evidence stays in service to the human story. The documents matter because they led back to Kimberly. The DNA matters because it restored connection. The mystery matters because real people lived inside it. The evidence also teaches us how hidden lives can leave beautiful and painful traces. Beautiful because a name can be recovered after decades. Painful because the recovery may reveal how alone someone had been, or how far from home she had traveled internally. The Lori Ruff case does not let us choose one feeling. It asks us to hold both. As the file grows thicker in your mind, you may notice that the central image remains the lockbox. It is easy to return to because it is so physical. A small hard container, a latch, documents inside, the sound of it opening, the smell of enclosed paper, the slight surprise of air meeting pages that had not been handled in a long time. A lockbox suggests control. Put something inside, close it, keep the key or combination, decide who gets access. Lori may have wanted control over the facts of her origin. Yet, after her death, the box shifted control to others. It became the place where the secret could be studied. Control passed from concealment to investigation. That passage from concealment to investigation is delicate. Families opening private containers after death often confront the question of privacy. What should remain private? What must be understood? In Lori's case, the documents did not merely reveal personal embarrassment. They revealed a false identity with legal and familial consequences. The need to understand was real. Still, we can acknowledge the intimacy of opening someone's hidden papers. It is never a neutral act. You may feel like an intruder even when you are doing what must be done. The Lori Ruff case carries that feeling. The truth was in private documents, and private documents had to become evidence. The transition itself is one more quiet sadness. The investigation did not begin by invading for curiosity's sake. It began because the discovered papers made ordinary understanding impossible. A dead child's birth certificate inside Lori's effects could not be ignored. A legal name change from that identity could not be waved away. These were not small inconsistencies. They were structural breaks in the story of who she had been. Structural breaks require careful support. You do not step heavily on a broken floor. You test each board. Investigators tested the records, followed the documents, and eventually brought in methods that could hold the weight. The Lori Ruff case needed that care because a wrong identification would have caused new harm. Accuracy was not optional. Genetic genealogy has power, but with power comes the duty to be exact. A near match is not a name. A family branch is not a final answer. Researchers must avoid the comfort of a story that merely feels right. In this case, the identification of Kimberly McLean became accepted because the evidence aligned across methods. You can feel the steadiness of that alignment. Steadiness is a good word for the people who worked the case over time. They had to keep returning to uncertainty without letting it harden into resignation. A cold case can make people tired. The same names, the same dead ends, the same unanswered calls. Yet sometimes the file changes because the world changes around it. A database grows, a method improves, a relative tests, a door opens. When that door opened for the Lori Ruff case, the old evidence was ready. The lockbox had already raised the right question. The birth certificate had already shown the false start. The name change had already traced the constructed identity. Genealogy did not replace those clues. It answered the question they had been asking for years. You can imagine placing the genetic finding beside the old documents. The modern printout looks different from the aged papers, cleaner, brighter, perhaps less tactile, yet it belongs with them. The old and new pages share the same table. Together they say, this woman was born Kimberly McLean, and the name Lori Ruff was part of the life she later built. From there, the case becomes a meditation on what it means to solve. We often use that word as if it closes everything. In the Lori Ruff case, solve means the identity was found. It means the strange evidence led to a true name. It does not mean every emotional question was settled. The word can be true and limited at the same time. Limited truth is still truth. You do not refuse a candle because it is not sunrise. The identification illuminated the room enough to see its shape. Some corners remained dim. That is acceptable if we are honest about it. The Lori Ruff case gives us a candle, and we follow it carefully through the parts of the room it can reach. In the candlelight, the borrowed birth certificate becomes one of the most important objects. It reveals both vulnerability and intention. It connects the case to a known method of assuming identity. It proves that Lori's official origin under that name was not genuine. Without it, the investigation might have lacked the first clear sign that the entire backstory needed rebuilding. The name change order is equally important, though quieter. It shows how a false beginning became a legally recognized adult identity. The language would have been plain, perhaps almost dull. That dullness gave it power. Once a court recognized the new name, later institutions could accept it without asking about the certificate behind it. The document became a bridge from borrowed identity to lived identity. The lockbox preserved both. That preservation makes it almost an accidental archive. Archives are usually built intentionally, with labels and catalogs, but private archives form in drawers and boxes all the time. People keep papers because they fear needing them, because they cannot bear to discard them, or because the papers mean something too complicated to name. Lori's box became an archive of a life split by names. The DNA evidence finally provided the living archive. It was not in the box, but in people. Relatives carrying shared ancestry, perhaps unaware that their own data or family lines could help identify a woman in Texas. This is one of the remarkable features of genetic genealogy. The archive is distributed across families, hidden in plain sight, waiting for comparison. Comparison brought Kimberly home to the record. You can hear how soft that phrase is, home to the record. Not home in the fullest sense, because she could not return as families would have wished. But home to the record matters. It means official and public knowledge no longer has to call her unknown. It means the first name can stand beside the last one. The next part of the file asks us to think about the emotional burden of aliases. An alias can protect, it can mislead, it can become a habit. Over years, it may stop feeling like a mask and start feeling like a face others recognize. Lori's adult name carried bills, relationships, routines, and legal status. Kimberly's birth name carried origin. The investigation had to hold both without collapsing them. You can feel that burden in the phrase also known as, "It looks simple in records, but it contains a life's fracture." Kimberly McLean, also known as Lori Erica Ruff. The words make a bridge, but they do not show the river below. You look at the phrase and know it is useful. You also know it is not enough. Not enough is a familiar feeling in cold case work. There is never quite enough testimony, enough context, enough time, enough surviving memory. Yet investigators proceed with what exists. The Lori Ruff case was not solved by waiting for perfect evidence. It was solved by treating imperfect evidence carefully until it could be strengthened by something new. The family's role in preserving and sharing the contents of the lockbox was part of that strengthening. Without their willingness to confront the documents, the case may have remained a private confusion. Bringing evidence forward can be painful, especially when it exposes family vulnerability, but it can also allow professionals and researchers to do what private grief cannot do alone. You can imagine the handover of documents, the careful explanations, the repeated question, "What does this mean?" The answer did not come in one piece. It came through stages. First, it means Lori had another identity. Then, it means that identity belonged to a deceased child. Then, it means Lori's true birth identity is still unknown. Later, it means she was Kimberly McLean. Each stage altered the emotional landscape. At first, confusion, then deeper confusion, then long uncertainty, then recognition. The mind has to adjust at every stage. You can see why the case drew people in, not because it was loud, but because each answered question revealed a more human one beneath it. The human question beneath the identity is why someone would choose such distance. We keep returning to it because the file keeps leaving it open, yet each return should be softer than the last. We do not need to press. We can note that the choice was deliberate, sustained, and consequential. We can also note that the private reason went with Lori when she died. This is where sleep and investigation share a rhythm. Both require letting go of certain demands. You can follow the facts until the facts stop, then allow the mind to rest beside the boundary. The Lori Ruff case is a good companion for that kind of listening because it offers a solved path and an unsolved interior. There is enough structure to follow and enough silence to soften into. The silence is not empty. It is filled with the presence of people who cared. Kimberly's family, Lori's married family, investigators, genealogists, even strangers who treated the case respectfully and helped keep attention on the identity question. A cold case file can look lonely, but many hands may have kept it from being forgotten. Forgetting is the quiet adversary in old mysteries. Not evil, exactly, just erosion. Papers misplaced, memories fading, agencies changing staff, technologies becoming obsolete. The Lori Ruff case resisted forgetting because the evidence was unusual enough to disturb the surface and because people preserved the question. The name Kimberly McLean returned because forgetting did not win completely. You can think of that as a modest mercy, not a perfect one, not a happy ending in the usual sense, but a mercy all the same. A woman known under a false identity was given back her birth name. Families were given a clearer truth. A child's misused record was understood for what it was. The public mystery narrowed into a documented life. The file continues, though, because narrowing is not the same as ending. There are still pathways to examine, not for conclusion yet, but for understanding the patient method. We can look more closely at how each piece of weird evidence changed the direction of inquiry. We can follow the birth certificate, the notes, the lockbox, and the genetic matches as separate currents before letting them meet again. Start with the birth certificate, and you are in the world of vital records. Birth certificates are meant to establish a beginning. They are among the earliest official statements a person receives. Name, date, place, parents. Such a document seems foundational because it is foundational. In Lori's case, the foundation belonged to someone else, and that changed everything built above it. A foundation can be hidden under a house for years. People walk across the floors without thinking about it. They hang curtains, cook meals, argue, laugh, and sleep. Only when a crack appears do they look below. The Becky Sue Turner certificate was the hidden foundation of Lori's official identity, and the crack appeared when investigators learned Becky had died as a child. That discovery would have shifted the investigation from biographical search to identity fraud inquiry. Who had access to the record? How was it obtained? What documents were issued afterward? Did the person use the name long enough to secure another? You can feel the questions becoming more procedural, which is often how investigators steady themselves when a fact is emotionally strange. Procedure can be a comfort. It gives the hands something to do. Make the call, request the record, check the date, confirm the death, trace the application. In the Lori Ruff case, procedure took the place of speculation in the early steps. It did not answer everything, but it kept the inquiry grounded. Then the name change order enters. It shows the transformation from Becky Sue Turner to Lori Erica Kennedy. That new name sounds ordinary enough, which is part of its effectiveness. It did not carry the burden of the stolen record on its face. Once created, it could move through the world as a legal identity. You can see how the past was folded and tucked away. The folding image feels right. Papers folded into envelopes, old names folded into new ones. A birth identity folded so deeply that even close relatives could not see it. But folds leave creases. The lockbox kept the creases. When investigators opened it, they could unfold the sequence and see where one layer had covered another. The notes, if we hold them separately, are more ambiguous. They belong to a different kind of evidence, more personal and less official. A note can suggest urgency, confusion, planning, or memory, but it rarely proves a path without support. In the Lori Ruff case, the notes added atmosphere and possible insight, yet the strongest solution came from documents and DNA. That distinction keeps the file steady. You can imagine a handwritten note beside a typed certificate. The handwriting feels intimate, perhaps uneven, perhaps hurried. The certificate feels formal and impersonal. One seems close to the mind. The other seems close to the state. Both can mislead if overread. Both can help if placed carefully. Patient investigation means neither worshipping nor dismissing either one. The lockbox, as a container, turns separate items into an evidence cluster. Items found together can imply connection, though investigators still have to test what kind. Lori kept these documents in one place. That matters. It suggests she understood their significance, or at least their usefulness. We cannot know her exact reason for keeping them, but their preservation allowed the later trail to form. The DNA evidence belongs to another category again. It is not chosen in the same way a document is chosen. Lori could choose a name, but not her inherited relationships. That contrast is why genealogy could solve what paperwork obscured. The chosen trail led to Becky. The inherited trail led to Kimberly. You can feel the quiet power of that difference. In a calm retelling, this contrast can carry the whole center of the case. The chosen paper identity and the unchosen biological identity moved separately for decades. After Lori's death, investigators placed them side by side. The paper trail said one thing, then contradicted itself. The genetic trail said another, and held. The answer came where the held trail met the broken one. The Lori Ruff case therefore belongs to a wider family of mysteries solved by old evidence meeting new science. There are cases where a stored envelope, a stamp, a hair, a bone, or a preserved swab waits years for technology to catch up. Here, the waiting object was more documentary than biological at first, but the principle is similar. Preserve the clue, and the future may learn how to read it. Reading changes over time. A clerk in 1988 read a name change petition for legal sufficiency. A family in 2010 read the same identity trail with shock. Investigators read it as evidence. Genealogists read DNA as family structure. The same life became legible in different ways depending on the reader and the era. You, as the quiet detective tonight, read it with all those layers in mind. You do not have to choose one layer as the only true one. You can let the administrative, familial, scientific, and emotional readings overlap. That overlap is where the case becomes rich without becoming loud. The facts remain calm. The meaning deepens. The old records also invite us to think about how names travel. A name can be spoken, signed, stamped, typed, indexed, and searched. It can sit in a database or on a brittle certificate. It can belong to one person and be used by another. In the Lori Ruff case, names traveled farther than they should have, and then, years later, the right name traveled back. Kimberly's name traveling back is a gentle image. It moves through family trees, through investigators' notes, through public reporting, through the corrected understanding of the case. It reaches the place in the file where the word unknown used to sit. You can imagine unknown being crossed out lightly, not with anger, but with care, and Kimberly McLean written beside it. A correction like that changes the future of the record. Anyone who opens the case afterward begins from more truth than those who opened it before. That is the quiet gift left by patient investigators. They make the next reading kinder. They reduce confusion for people they may never meet. The Lori Ruff case now begins with a recovered name, not only a mystery. Even so, when we tell it slowly, we should preserve the experience of not knowing for a while. Otherwise, the work disappears. If we rush straight to Kimberly, we miss the years when Lori's origin was blank, when Becky's name confused the trail, when the lockbox raised questions no one could answer. The patience is part of the story, not merely the delay before the answer. That patience had texture, the rough edge of copied records, the dry feel of manila folders, the glow of a computer screen late at night, the low murmur of a records office. The pause after a phone call gives no new information. These textures make the investigation real in the body. They remind you that solving a case is something people physically do, hour after hour. The hour after hour quality is often missing from neat case summaries. A summary says investigators traced documents and used genealogy. The lived work says someone searched, waited, checked, doubted, corrected, and searched again. You can feel the difference. The Lori Ruff case deserves the lived version because the solution depended on endurance more than drama. Endurance also belongs to the families. Kimberly's birth family endured absence. Lori's married family endured secrecy, revealed after loss. Becky Sue Turner's family, in another way, had their child's name pulled into a mystery long after her death. The case touches many forms of endurance, and none should be treated carelessly. Care is a recurring method here. Care in preserving documents, care in comparing dates, care in speaking of the dead, care in distinguishing known fact from possible motive, care in remembering that every name in the file belonged to a person before it became evidence. The Lori Ruff case can be told calmly because care gives the narration its pace. The next page in your imagined file might show a simple list of aliases. Kimberly McLean, Becky Sue Turner, Lori Erica Kennedy, Lori Erica Ruff. 4 names, 1 of them borrowed, 2 of them adopted through legal or marital processes, 1 of them original. The list looks short, but it contains decades. You can run your eyes over it and feel how much a name can carry. The original name carries childhood. The borrowed name carries the false doorway. The chosen legal name carries reinvention. The married name carries adult family life. None of these categories is complete by itself. Together they form a map of identity under pressure. The Lori Ruff case asks us to read that map without simplifying the terrain. Terrain matters because paths are shaped by it. We do not know the inner terrain that Kimberly crossed when she left. We know the outer marks she left later. If the inner terrain was rocky, frightened, determined, or numb, the documents do not say. They only show that she moved decisively into another identity and maintained it. That is enough to take seriously. Taking it seriously means avoiding easy explanations. It was not simply a prank, not simply a paperwork oddity, not simply a curiosity. It was a life-altering concealment. It affected how she related to others and how others understood her after death. The strange evidence solved the identity, but it also revealed the scale of the hidden choice. Scale is sometimes hard to feel in documents. A single court order can stand for years of consequence. A certificate can stand for a whole false beginning. A lockbox can stand for decades of silence. You sit with the papers long enough, and their scale begins to emerge. The Lori Ruff case grows larger not by adding spectacle, but by letting ordinary evidence show its reach. That reach extended into legal identity, family history, public records, and personal memory. It extended backward to Kimberly's childhood and sideways to Becky's record. It extended forward to Lori's daughter and to the families who would carry the knowledge after her death. The case is a web, and the evidence solved it by finding the strand that led back to the center. A web can be delicate and strong at once. Touch one strand, and another trembles. In the Lori Ruff case, touching the Becky Sue Turner record made the name change tremble. Touching the name change made the adult identity tremble. Touching the DNA matches made the unknown origin tremble until Kimberly's name appeared. The movement was subtle, but it passed through the whole structure. You can feel how patient hands are needed with such a web. Pull too hard, and you tear meaning apart. Move too quickly, and you confuse one strand for another. The investigators had to proceed slowly enough that the structure could reveal itself. That is the mood we keep, slow enough for each strand to be seen. The case also invites a quiet reflection on archives of the self. Most of us leave behind versions of who we are in many places. Government offices, family albums, school records, emails, photographs, medical forms, handwritten notes. Lori left behind a divided archive. Some parts said Lori, some pointed to Becky. The missing part said Kimberly, and it had to be recovered from elsewhere. A divided archive can make a person seem fractured after death. Those left behind must decide how to arrange the pieces. Which name goes first? Which documents matter most? Which memories remain trustworthy? The Lori Ruff case required that rearrangement on a public scale. The final arrangement did not erase complexity. It made the complexity readable. Readable complexity is perhaps the best outcome many cold cases can offer. Not simple closure, not perfect explanation, but a truthful arrangement of complicated facts. Kimberly McLean became Lori Ruff through a constructed identity that began with Becky Sue Turner's record. That arrangement is complicated, but readable. It allows compassion to settle in places where confusion once crowded everything. As the night moves on, the file's edges seem softer. You know the main path now, but there is still value in walking beside it, noticing the smaller stones, the date of the name change, the preservation of the papers, the reluctance around family history, the eventual involvement of genealogical methods. Each stone has a place, and each place helps keep the path from disappearing again. Disappearance is not always physical. Sometimes a person disappears behind a name. Sometimes a history disappears behind refusal. Sometimes a family story disappears because no one knows where to attach it. The Lori Ruff case is about all three. Kimberly disappeared physically from her family's life, then documentarily behind Lori, then reappeared through evidence that had waited long enough. The reappearance did not restore time. That is important. Cold case solutions often return truth but not years. They can answer the question on the file label, but they cannot give back ordinary afternoons that might have been shared. The answer is still valuable. It is just not magical. The Lori Ruff case offers truth with limits, and those limits deserve to be named gently when the time comes. For now, we remain inside the process. You can picture the genealogical narrowing continuing, branch by branch. A cousin match here, a public record there, a family line moving from one state to another. Researchers are, in a sense, walking through a forest of names, marking trees with quiet care. Most are not the tree they need. One branch eventually leads toward Kimberly. The moment before certainty may have been especially quiet. Investigators may have had a strong hypothesis, then needed confirmation. That interval can be difficult. You are close enough to feel the answer, but not close enough to speak it responsibly. Patient work demands restraint at exactly that point. The name must wait until the evidence can hold it. When the evidence held, Kimberly's name could be spoken. You can imagine the file changing after that. Notes rewritten, timelines updated. The unknown woman no longer unknown. Lori Ruff understood as a later identity, not an origin. The case's center of gravity shifts, and everyone reading afterward must adjust their balance. Balance is what we keep practicing. We balance the weirdness of the evidence with the softness of the telling. We balance the solved identity with the unsolved motive. We balance Lori's choices with compassion for Lori as a person. We balance the family's need for truth with respect for the parts of Kimberly's inner life that remain beyond us. The room is very still around that balance. A lamp, a file, a glass of water, perhaps the faint smell of paper warmed by light. You turn one page and find no sudden revelation, only another supporting detail. That is fitting. Most of the Lori Ruff case works by support, not surprise. One fact supports another until the structure can stand. The structure now stands on a true name, and from that place, the next pages can look more closely at the years when Lori lived under the identity she had made, while the earlier name waited unseen beneath the surface. The structure now stands on a true name, and the quietest part of the Lori Ruff case is that the evidence did answer the question it could answer. The woman known in Texas as Lori Erica Ruff was identified as Kimberly McLean. And that part of the mystery was solved after years of patient work, old documents, careful records, and genetic genealogy coming together at last. But the deeper question, the reason she left her first name behind and carried another life so completely, was never fully answered, and no document in the lockbox ever gave that private silence a clear voice. So we let the solved part rest beside the unsolved part, without asking one to erase the other. You can imagine the lockbox closed again now, not to hide the truth, but because the papers have done what they were able to do. The birth certificate, the name change, the old notes, the family lines, all of them have settled into place, and the room feels softer for having followed them slowly. Kimberly's name is no longer lost inside the file. Lori's life is no longer without a beginning. Becky Sue Turner's record is understood for the strange and sorrowful role it played. The work did not make the story simple, but it made it more truthful. And sometimes truth arrives with a lowered voice, not as an ending that explains everything, but as a small lamp left burning over what can finally be known. You can leave the remaining question where it is tonight. It does not need to be solved by imagination, and it does not need to keep you awake. Some parts of a person's life stay folded beyond our reach, even after the records are corrected and the names are returned. The file is quieter now, the pages are still, and the unanswered space can rest in the dark with everything else.